Hello beautiful people. Welcome to Gringotts Hub. In today's episode, we explore, what if Harry used the death stick to summon the spirit of Merlin and they abolished the ministry together? Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The wand remembers the tomb was white in the moonlight, and Harry had been standing in front of it for nearly an hour without saying a word. He hadn't planned to come here. That was the honest truth of it. He'd operate from Grimmauld Place at 11:30 with no particular destination in mind, just the restless, electric feeling under his skin that had been building for weeks, and somehow his feet, or maybe the magic in him, or maybe something older than either, had brought him here, to the edge of the lake at Hogwarts, to the white marble tomb where Albus Dumbledore lay with his hands folded and the Elder Wand placed between them. Except the Elder Wand wasn't between Dumbledore's hands anymore. It was in Harry's right fist, and had been for the better part of an hour. He'd broken the tomb open 6 days ago, in the dark, alone. He hadn't told anyone. Not Ron, not Hermione, not Ginny. He'd come at 2 in the morning, cast the same unlocking charm he'd watched Voldemort use through the Horcrux vision 3 years earlier, and he'd reached into that cold white marble and taken the wand back out. His wand. The one that answered to him. The most powerful object in the history of magic, and he'd been walking around with it tucked inside his jacket for less than a week and already the shape of everything felt different. The thing was, and this was what Harry couldn't explain to anyone, not even to himself, he hadn't taken it to snap it. He'd told himself that was the plan. All year he'd been telling himself that. Snap it, bury the pieces somewhere separate, and let that be the end of it. Very clean. Very tidy. Very Dumbledore, actually, in the way it asked the person holding all the power to simply give it up for everyone else's peace of mind. But he'd come here tonight, on the exact 1-year anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts, and he was still holding it, and the reason he hadn't let himself say clearly until this moment, standing here with the lake perfectly still and the castle dark behind him, was that snapping it felt like lying. Because the world was not fixed. That was the thing no one wanted to say out loud. They'd had the victory parties, the memorial services, the long slow summer of grief and then the cautious optimism of autumn, and now spring had turned into a full year and Harry had watched, very carefully, because watching things was something he was unfortunately good at, the Ministry of Magic reassemble itself into almost exactly the shape it had been before. Not Voldemort's ministry. Not the Blood Registry, not the Muggle-born Registration Commission, not Dementors in the courtroom. Nothing quite that overt. Just, quietly, slowly, with the bureaucratic patience of people who had been doing this for generations, the old families moving back into the old positions. The committees being stacked. The Wisingamot filling up with familiar surnames. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who was a good man and a strong one, slowly being surrounded by advisors he hadn't chosen and couldn't dismiss without triggering a political crisis that would consume his entire administration. Last week, Harry had read a proposed piece of legislation in the Daily Prophet, tucked into page 12, beneath a story about a Quidditch transfer, called the Magical Heritage Registration Act. It would require all witches and wizards in Britain to file documentation proving 3 generations of magical ancestry. They hadn't even changed the structure of it. Just the name. Harry looked down at the Elder Wand. The Elder Wand looked back at him, in the way that things without eyes can still look back at you, with a kind of patient, waiting attention that had been unnerving him all week. "All right," he said aloud. His voice came out steadier than he felt, which was useful. "I know you're not just a piece of wood." The lake moved slightly. The wand stayed still in his hand, but something in the quality of his awareness shifted, like a room where someone has just sat up. "Dumbledore told me about the Hallows. The Peverell brothers. The story. But that's not the whole story, is it?" Harry kept his eyes on the white marble, not because he was talking to Dumbledore but because he needed to look at something that wasn't the wand while he was talking about it. "Something made you. Before the Peverells. Before death, if the legend means anything. There's something in you that's older than any of that, and I think I know what it is." He'd spent 3 months in the Hogwarts library, which was a thing he'd never voluntarily done in his entire school career and which Hermione had found completely hilarious until she'd noticed what section he kept disappearing into. Not defense against the dark arts. Not advanced transfiguration. The restricted shelves in the historical magic wing, the ones that required a note from a professor and smelled of something older than the castle itself. The founders had been the beginning of it. Reading about them, really reading, not the sanitized textbook versions but the original accounts, the ones written in archaic English by people who'd actually been there, he'd found references to before the founders. To the person who had shaped British magical society in the first place. The one who had established the first Wisengamot, drawn the first lines between magical and Muggle Britain, laid down the principles of magical law that every subsequent generation had built upon. And in one account, a handwritten manuscript from approximately 500 AD, fragile as dry leaves, that a meticulous Hogwarts archivist had preserved under 17 protective charms, Harry had found a single paragraph that had stopped him cold. The Elder Stick was not crafted by death nor by any mortal hand alone. It was shaped over 40 years by the greatest practitioner of living magic this isle has known, who bound into it not merely power but intention, his own ongoing will, so that it might outlast him and continue the work he could not finish in a single life. When the work is done, the intention may be released. When the intention is released, the maker may answer. Harry had read it 4 times. Then he'd closed the book very carefully, put it back exactly where he'd found it, walked to the bathroom down the corridor, and spent 5 minutes with cold water on his face. Then he'd gone back, taken the book out again, and started taking notes. "I'm not doing the wand work part of it incorrectly," Harry said now, to the wand and the knight and whatever was listening. "I checked it 6 different ways. The anchor point casting, the resonance address in Old Gaelic, I had a translation charm running the whole time, it sounded ridiculous but the theory is sound." He exhaled. "The problem is I don't know if any of this actually works or if I've just been reading old books for 3 months because it was better than watching the ministry turn back into what it was." He turned the wand over in his hand. In the moonlight it was bone-white and absolutely motionless, and then, between 1 second and the next, it was warm. Not wand in your hand warm. Warm. Like something had just woken up inside it and the warmth was the first breath. Harry's heart rate did something complicated. "Okay," he said. "Okay, that's new." He raised the wand. The incantation was in Old Gaelic and he'd been practicing it for 2 weeks until he could say it without the translation running, because the manuscript had been very specific that it needed to be spoken in the original. He took 1 breath, let it out, and spoke. The words came out of him differently than any spell he'd ever cast. Not louder, actually quieter, if anything, but with a quality he didn't have a technical term for. Like they went down into the ground as much as out into the air. Like the magic wasn't projecting outward from the wand but unspooling backward, down into something buried very deep. For a moment nothing happened. Then the lake exploded. Not violently, not Voldemort's death explosion, not basilisk explosion. The surface of it just erupted upward all at once in a sheet of white water that hung in the air, perfectly still, for 2 full seconds, lit silver by the moon, and every fish and creature in it was briefly visible, suspended, before the whole thing collapsed back down with a sound like a thunderclap and a wave that soaked Harry's shoes entirely. The wand in his hand went from warm to blazing, a heat that should have been painful and somehow wasn't, and the light coming off it wasn't the usual wand spark gold but something older, a deep amber that flickered like a fire seen through very old glass. Harry didn't lower it. Didn't step back. He'd made a promise to himself when he came out here, one of the reasons he hadn't told anyone, that whatever happened, he wasn't going to flinch. The light from the wand gathered. That was the only word for it. It pulled itself together from the surrounding air, not ghostly, not dead white like nearly headless Nick, not the faint pearlescent shimmer of a memory in a pensieve, and became a presence. Approximately man-shaped, approximately standing on the grass, approximately looking at Harry with something that might have been eyes. Then it sharpened, and it was unmistakably a man, and he was looking at Harry with an expression that contained multitudes. He was younger than Harry had expected. That was the first thing. Not old sage, white beard, pointed hat, young, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, somewhere in his middle 30s, dressed in robes that would have looked archaic in any century but somehow managed to look perfectly comfortable on him. He was tall. He had the hands of someone who'd spent decades working with them and the eyes of someone who had seen several things no living person could imagine. He also looked, at this precise moment, mildly incredulous. "You're serious," he said. His voice was low and warm and carried an accent Harry couldn't place exactly, Old British in the way that a stone circle is old, before any dialect had settled into being. "Yes," Harry said. "You actually." The figure looked down at itself, then at the wand in Harry's hand, then at the soaking wet grass and Harry's dripping shoes. "How long did you spend in the library?" 3 months. 3 months. The figure made a sound that was almost a laugh. "And before that?" "How long debating whether to snap me in half?" "About 8 months. "I see." The presence, Merlin, because that was who this was, that was who Harry had called and who had answered, looked at Harry with those eyes that had seen too much and were currently adjusting to seeing something new. "You chose not to." "Obviously." "Why?" Harry looked at him steadily. "Because the world isn't fixed yet." Something shifted in those ancient eyes. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. "No," Merlin agreed quietly. "It isn't, is it?" It wasn't a question. He looked past Harry toward the castle, and his expression did something complicated, the look of a man seeing something both familiar and unrecognizable, like finding a childhood home that has had 3 stories added and the garden paved over. "Hogwarts," he said, after a moment. "You knew it?" "I watched them build it." He said it simply, without grandeur. Godric had very strong opinions about the West Tower. So did Rowena. There was an argument about structural wards that lasted 11 weeks. He tilted his head. "The East Tower is lower than they originally intended." That was a compromise. Harry looked at the East Tower. "Ha. Yes." Merlin looked back at Harry. The assessment in his gaze was thorough and not unkind. "You're the Potter boy." "Harry." "Yes." "The one who defeated," he paused, and something crossed his face that Harry recognized instinctively, the look of someone deciding not to say the name because it still carries weight it shouldn't. "The one the prophecy was about." "I've had about a year to get used to people saying that," Harry said. "It doesn't get more comfortable. Prophecies rarely leave the people they're about with much dignity." Merlin said it with a dry sympathy that felt genuine. Mordred featured in 3. I read the first one when he was 2 years old and managed to do absolutely nothing useful with the information. "Yeah, well." Harry was studying him. The presence was solid enough to read as real, not quite physical, not quite not. He could see the grass through Merlin's robes if he looked slightly sideways, but looking straight on there was nothing ghostly about him. "I read that you built the Wisengamot." "The original, yes. I also built the first international magical cooperation framework, established the precursor statutes to what became the Statute of Secrecy, and laid the groundwork for every significant piece of magical governance in this island." He paused. "I'm aware of what that implies, given why you're standing here. You know what they've done with it?" Merlin looked at him steadily. "I have been in that wand for 1500 years. I have been present for every use of it. Every single one." His voice remained level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "I watched everything. I could not speak. Could not intervene. I was, how would you put it, aware, but without agency. Like being in a very long, very detailed dream." Harry let that sit for a moment. 1500 years of watching and being unable to move. He didn't have a response that wasn't inadequate. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Merlin looked at him with something like surprise. For what specifically? For taking that long to let you out. There was a pause. Something in Merlin's expression shifted in a way that Harry couldn't fully read, and then it settled, and he said, very quietly, there were worse custodians than you, in the end. It might have been the nicest thing anyone had ever said to Harry by not saying it at all, and Harry decided immediately that he liked this man enormously. Here's the situation, Harry said, because if he stood here being moved by it he'd stand here all night, and there was work to do. He ran through it quickly and without self-pity: Voldemort, the war, the year after, Kingsley, the Magical Heritage Registration Act, page 12, the date on the prophet from this morning. He watched Merlin's face the whole time. The expression didn't really change, which Harry was starting to understand meant the opposite of what it would on most people. Still water runs deep in ways that turbulent water doesn't. When Harry finished, Merlin was quiet for 5 seconds. Then, show me this registration act. Harry pulled the folded page from his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying it since the morning, which was probably something his therapist would have an opinion about if he had a therapist, and held it out. Merlin took it and read it, and this was interesting because his hands were solid enough to hold paper but his reading style was nothing like a living person's. He took in the whole page in approximately 4 seconds, and then read it again more slowly, and then set his jaw in a way that made Harry very glad he wasn't Dolores Umbridge. There are 17 direct structural inheritances from my original Wisengamot charter in this document, Merlin said, all of them corrupted beyond recognition. I counted 15. You missed the ancestry waiting clause in subsection 3 and the ancestral exception provision buried in the definitions appendix. The definitions appendix, Harry repeated. Of course. Administrative power always lives in the definitions. Merlin folded the page with precise, furious care. The people who built this understand exactly what they're doing. This isn't ignorance. This isn't carelessness. He looked up. Who is driving it? The Preservation Council. It's a block within the ministry, technically a cultural preservation committee, actually a faction dedicated to restoring pure blood hierarchy under the language of magical tradition. They control 3 departments and 17 Wisengamot seats. Their public face is a woman named Umbridge. Harry kept his voice even saying the name. Their money and strategy comes from Lucius Malfoy. Malfoy. Merlin turned the name over. Old family. Very. Norman extraction, originally. They've been reconfiguring their political position since their primary patron, Voldemort, died. Umbridge is the face because she's genuinely true-believing. Malfoy is the brain because he thinks in generational timescales. Merlin looked at him with something that might have been approval. You've been thinking about this for a while. I've had a year. Most 19-year-olds who just survived a war spend that year doing something else. Most 19-year-olds didn't watch someone get killed because of a policy the ministry refused to change. Harry's voice was flat. Not bitter, he'd spent a long time with the bitterness and come out the other side of it into something colder and more useful. Cedric Diggory. Sirius Black. Fred Weasley. Remus Lupin. Every single one of them died because of decisions made by people in that building, or because of systems those people let grow. I'm done watching. Merlin looked at him for a long time without speaking. The lake was still again behind him, and the castle was still dark, and the silence was the kind that a person sits in when they're making a decision about someone's character. What's your plan? Merlin said at last. I was hoping, Harry said, that you might have some opinions about that. I have opinions about everything. It's one of the consistent afflictions of being me. But there was something alive in his expression now that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. The wand will sustain my presence for as long as you carry it and choose to maintain the summoning. I am fully capable of independent magical action in this state, not physical contact with the world, but anything involving magic directly. He looked at his own hands. More than I was. Much more, actually. The wand responds differently to you than it has to almost anyone else. You could tell. I told you. I watched every use of it. He glanced at Harry. The way it responds to your intent rather than your command, that's rare. Most users of the Elder Wand in the last 15 centuries treated it like a superior tool. You treat it like, he paused, apparently searching for an accurate description. Like a conversation. Harry looked at the wand in his hand. It felt like that. Like it was waiting to be asked something rather than just used. Because that's what it is. That's what I made it to be. Merlin's voice carried something old and complicated. The power is real. It isn't an illusion and it won't do what you don't mean. But it was always meant to be wielded in service of something larger than the wielder. He looked past Harry toward the castle again. I made it for a purpose I ran out of time to complete. What purpose? The look Merlin turned on him then was very direct. The same one you're standing here at midnight trying to do. Harry held that for a moment. Right, he said. Then we should probably talk about logistics. Merlin blinked. Then he laughed, and it was a real laugh, surprised out of him, and it made him look exactly like what he was, someone who had been waiting a very long time for someone to say precisely that. Yes, he said. I think we probably should. They were deep in it, Harry laying out the political landscape, Merlin asking questions that cut so precisely to the center of every issue that Harry felt simultaneously very intelligent for thinking about this and very aware of how much he still didn't understand, when a crack of apparition split the night behind them and Hermione Granger came striding across the grass with her robes on inside out, hair in a wild braid, and a sheaf of papers tucked under her arm. She stopped. Looked at Merlin. Looked at Harry. Looked at the Elder Wand in Harry's hand, still faintly glowing amber. Looked back at Merlin. You weren't answering your mirror, she said to Harry. I didn't take it with me. I know you didn't take it with you, Harry, that's why I'm here instead of, is that, she looked at Merlin again with the expression of someone trying to maintain professional composure over something extraordinary. That is, you're, Merlin, Merlin confirmed. Right. Hermione took a breath. Right, of course. Of course you are. She looked at Harry with an expression that contained absolute exasperation, the particular variety she reserved for situations that were technically his fault even when they were also entirely justified. You've been in that restricted archive for 3 months. Yes. And you didn't tell me. I didn't know if it would work. Harry, you could have told me and we'd have found out together whether it would work, that's literally what I'm for, that's what friends are. She stopped, closed her eyes, and regrouped. When she opened them she turned to Merlin with the polite, direct, and absolutely relentless attention she gave to everyone who she considered worth taking seriously. How much do you know about the current situation? I've been in the wand for 1500 years, Merlin said. I know the current situation in terms of its political structure and its principal actors. I lack granular detail on recent events and I would particularly benefit from detailed knowledge of the Wizengamot's current procedural rules, since I'm told they've been revised approximately 40 times since the structure I designed. Hermione's eyes lit up in a way that Harry recognized from every year of their friendship, the specific illumination of someone who has been waiting all their life to have exactly this conversation. She sat down cross-legged on the wet grass, opened her sheaf of papers, and started talking. What followed was 2.5 hours that Harry would later describe to Ron as, the most terrifying meeting I've ever been in, and I've spoken directly to Voldemort twice. Hermione laid out the Wizengamot's current procedural rules, standing committee structure, ministerial appointment process, and the precise legislative pathway of the Magical Heritage Registration Act with the systematic clarity of someone who had been quietly compiling all of this for 6 months. Merlin listened with his full and considerable attention, asked 17 questions that each peeled back another layer of the problem, and offered 2 procedural mechanisms that technically still existed in the Wizengamot Charter, because he had originally written them and they had never been formally repealed, that would allow the act to be challenged not as a political matter but as a structural one. A foundational challenge, Hermione said, sitting forward. Not, this policy is bad but this policy violates the constitutive principles of the institution itself. Which it does, Merlin said, because I wrote those constitutive principles and I'm sitting here telling you so. Could you testify? Hermione asked immediately. Merlin looked at her with something that was clearly becoming appreciation. In what capacity? The charter includes an authorial authority provision. Again, you wrote it, Article 7 of the original founding document. Any party claiming authorial standing can challenge any provision on the grounds that it violates the original legislative intent. It's never been used because the author of the original charter has technically been unavailable. She looked at him with absolute focus. He's no longer unavailable. The silence that followed this was the kind that comes before something significant. Miss Granger, Merlin said slowly. Hermione, please. Hermione. When you say, testify, you're aware that my presence in this world exists entirely through a wand-based resonance summoning that technically has no precedent in British magical law and therefore no legal standing whatsoever. It has no precedent, Hermione agreed, which means it also has no prohibitions. There is no law specifically excluding summoned resonances from giving testimony because nobody anticipated the situation. And with Harry as the wand's master, his presence legally anchors yours. If we structure it correctly, we'd be making law as we challenge law, Merlin said. Yes. Hermione smiled, and it was the smile she got when a plan clicked into shape. Rather fitting, don't you think? Harry had been quiet through most of this, watching. He watched Merlin's face as Hermione talked and he saw the exact moment, it was subtle, just a slight straightening, a particular quality of attention, when Merlin stopped assessing and started committing. The Preservation Council will see this coming, Merlin said. Once we file a foundational challenge, they'll know what we're doing. They'll have time to prepare a counter-strategy. They'll have time to prepare a counter-strategy that isn't sufficient, Harry said. Both Merlin and Hermione looked at him. They've been managing bureaucratic opposition for decades, Harry continued. Petitions, challenges, political pressure, they know how to absorb all of that. What they don't know how to manage, he looked at Merlin, is you. The actual author of the document they've been corrupting, standing in front of the Wizengamot. And you, Hermione said, in a tone that was less a compliment and more an observation. You're the master of the Elder Wand, Harry. Publicly. Everyone knows Voldemort had it and you defeated him. That means magically, symbolically, legally, the most powerful object in the world's magical history answers to you. They'll say it's theater, Harry said. They'll try to reframe it as spectacle. Let them, Merlin said quietly. Theater is only ineffective when the audience isn't paying attention. You put the actual author of the Wizengamot Charter in front of the Wizengamot, using Article 7 of the founding document to challenge a legislative descendant of Voldemort's own blood laws, he paused. It's not theater. It's a mirror. Hermione was writing rapidly. I'll need 3 days to file the foundational challenge properly. We'll need to establish standing, get Harry registered as Wand Master of Record, and have the authorial summoning witnessed and notarized by a magical authenticator. McGonagall, Harry said immediately. She's the only one I trust completely. Agreed. Kingsley should know, but quietly, not through ministry channels. We go to him directly. He'll want to help, Harry said, and we'll need to be honest with him about why he can't do this through official channels. Because the official channels are what we're challenging, Merlin said. Yes. The word settled between the three of them with a particular weight that Harry felt in his chest. This was the point, he understood it very clearly, standing here at almost 3 in the morning on the anniversary of a battle that had cost more than anyone should ever have to pay, this was the exact point of no return. Filing that challenge would tell Umbridge. Would tell Malfoy. Would start a sequence of events with no guaranteed ending. He looked at the wand in his hand. The amber light had dimmed to almost nothing, but the warmth was still there. Harry, Hermione said, and her voice was quieter now. Are you sure about this? He thought about it. Genuinely, for a full 30 seconds, he thought about it, about snapping the wand, about finishing school, about Ginny and the quiet life and the Auror career and the idea of being done, and then he thought about Fred's face, and Cedric's, and Dobby's, and the look on Kingsley's face at the last ministry briefing Harry had attended, the look of a man trying to hold a crumbling wall together with his bare hands. "I'm sure," he said. Hermione nodded. She looked at Merlin. "What do you need?" "To maintain presence, to function, to, whatever the equivalent of rest is for you in this state." "Proximity to the wand. Harry needs to carry it, or at minimum keep it within 10 feet. When not actively manifested Merlin considered the right word. Dormant, but aware. Like sleeping with the window open. I can come to full presence when needed in approximately 3 seconds. That's useful, Harry said. I have been in a wand for 1500 years, Merlin said, with dry patience. I have had considerable time to think about how to be as useful as possible once given the opportunity. Harry pocketed the Elder Wand. The moment it was in his jacket, the amber light vanished and Merlin became less. Still there, in the particular way Harry could now feel as a kind of background awareness, a warmth against his ribs. Dormant. But present. Hermione was already on her feet, gathering her papers. I'll go to Hogwarts. McGonagall will be up, she's always up at odd hours, I don't think she actually sleeps properly. We'll get the witnessing done tonight while there's nobody around to notice. She looked at Harry sharply. You should have told me. I know. 3 months, Harry. I know. You were in the restricted archive reading 700-year-old manuscripts in Old Gaelic and you didn't, I know, Hermione. She gave him the look, which was the specific Hermione expression that meant I love you and I'm furious and both of those things will remain true indefinitely, and then turned on her heel and started toward the castle. Harry fell into step beside her. The grass was wet under his feet and the castle was beginning to show the first faint gray at its edges that meant dawn was a few hours away, and somewhere inside his jacket a 1500-year-old wizard was dormant and waiting and, Harry was fairly certain, quietly furious about what had been done to his life's work. She's extraordinary, Merlin said, low and internal, not quite a voice and not quite a thought, a new mode of communication that Harry was going to have to get used to. Your friend. Yes, Harry agreed, quietly enough that Hermione wouldn't hear. She is. If she'd been born in my time, the world would look very different. It's going to look very different now, Harry said. A pause. Then, with a warmth that Harry felt more than heard, yes. I rather think it is. They walked toward the castle through the last of the dark, and behind them the lake was perfectly still, and the white marble tomb stood empty, and the night was full of the particular electric quality of something enormous that has just begun. Chapter 2, The Shape of the Rot. Minerva McGonagall opened her office door at 3:47 in the morning wearing tartan robes and an expression that suggested she had not, in fact, been asleep. She looked at Harry. She looked at Hermione. She looked at the faint amber warmth emanating from the wand visible at Harry's jacket pocket. I see, she said, and stepped aside to let them in. That was the thing about McGonagall, she never wasted energy on reactions that weren't useful. She'd been teaching magic for 40 years, had fought in 2 wars, had watched Dumbledore do things that defied every category of possible, and had arrived somewhere on the other side of all of it where surprise was simply not a resource she allocated generously. She made tea with a flick of her wand, gestured them toward the chairs in front of her desk, sat down behind it, and said, explain. From the beginning, with precision. Harry explained. Hermione supplemented. When Harry reached the part about the summoning, McGonagall's eyes moved to his jacket pocket and stayed there with an attention that was not afraid of what it found. Merlin, she said flatly. Professor McGonagall. The warmth at Harry's ribs became a presence beside him, and Merlin was there in the chair, not quite solid, not quite not, inclining his head with the particular courtesy of someone who knows their name carries weight but doesn't trade on it. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that Harry couldn't entirely read, decades of professional composure over something that might have been awe, or might have been grief, or might have been both at once, the feeling of seeing history step out of a painting and into the room. "I taught from your founding principles for 38 years, she said finally. "Then you know how far the institution has drifted from them," Merlin said. "I know exactly how far." Her voice was level and her jaw was set. "What do you need from me?" Hermione opened her folder. The witnessing took 40 minutes. McGonagall signed every document with the same uncompromising precision she'd applied to every detention slip, every examination certificate, every formal record in her 40-year career, and when it was done she tapped the stack of papers with her wand and produced a magical authentication seal that hummed with the particular resonance of institutional authority, the Hogwarts seal, the oldest continuously active magical authentication in Britain, carrying more foundational weight in wizarding law than anything the current ministry could produce. "This establishes Harry's standing as wand master of record," Hermione said, shuffling the authenticated copies. "And the authorial presence attestation gives Merlin legal standing as original charter author under Article 7. It's not watertight yet, Umbridge will challenge the authenticity of the summoning, but it shifts the burden of proof onto them to disprove it, which means they'd have to argue in open Wisengamot that the Elder Wand doesn't actually respond to its documented master." She looked up. "Which would be a deeply unwise argument to make in front of an audience. Given that the documented master would be standing there holding it," Harry said. "Precisely." McGonagall had been reading the Magical Heritage Registration Act while Hermione talked. She set it down with the controlled delicacy of someone placing something dangerous. "Who wrote this?" "The drafting committee has 12 names on it," Hermione said. "Functionally, our best assessment is that the language came from Percy Blythe at Magical Law Enforcement and was strategically shepherded by Umbridge herself." "Blythe?" McGonagall's mouth thinned. "He was a Slytherin. 6 years below you, Harry. Exceptional marks, almost no moral imagination whatsoever. The sort of mind that is genuinely dangerous because it can build anything it's pointed at without ever asking whether it should." She looked at Harry. "You'll go to Kingsley today." "This morning," Harry confirmed. "Directly, not through ministry channels." "He's been constrained," McGonagall said carefully. The word did a great deal of work in the way she said it. "There are 3 advisors around him at all times now, ostensibly a ministerial support office. They were appointed by a committee vote in December that Kingsley didn't have the numbers to block. They report to the Ministerial Oversight Board." She paused. "Which is chaired by Umbridge." Harry looked at her. "A committee appointed an oversight board to monitor the minister, who in turn appointed support staff to manage his schedule and communications, yes." "That's actually quite elegant," Merlin said, in the voice of someone who finds something technically impressive while finding it morally repugnant. "They've built a cage around him that looks like furniture." "How long has this been going on?" Harry asked McGonagall. "The Oversight Board was formally constituted in January. The infrastructure for it," she picked up her tea and looked at it instead of at them, which was the McGonagall version of a tell, "has been in construction since approximately October." 2 months after the Battle of Hogwarts," Harry said. "Yes." He sat with that. 2 months. While they'd been burying their dead and learning how to sleep again and trying to remember what normal felt like, the Preservation Council had been building a cage around the Minister of Magic. They'd started before the bodies were cold. "All right," Harry said. He stood up. Hermione looked at him. "We go to Kingsley at 8. I want him to have the full picture before anyone else knows we're moving." "I'll come with you," Hermione said, gathering her papers. "No." Harry shook his head. "You need to file the foundational challenge today, before they have any warning. The moment we talk to Kingsley, the clock starts, someone will notice, someone will report to Umbridge, and we need the challenge already on record before they can do anything to preempt it." Hermione opened her mouth. "I know," Harry said. "I know you want to be in both places. But you filing that challenge is the more important thing. She closed her mouth. Looked at her papers. Looked at Harry. The challenge has to go to the Wisengamot clerk's office directly, not through the standard ministry filing system, because the standard ministry filing system routes through magical law enforcement, which is controlled by the Preservation Council, Harry said. So you need to go in person, to the clerk's office, and hand it directly to Gawain Wimple, who's been clerk since 1987 and is deeply proceduralist in a way that means he'll process a correctly formatted challenge regardless of its political content, because that's his job, and the one thing the Preservation Council hasn't managed to corrupt yet is his sense of professional duty. She was on her feet now, pulling on her traveling cloak. Do not let anyone else take those documents. Ron's coming with me, Harry said. Ron doesn't know about any of this yet, Hermione pointed out. He's about to. McGonagall stood and held open her office door with the air of someone releasing two very purposeful people into the world. She looked at Harry as he passed and said, quietly, "Be careful. Not because I think you should be afraid of them, I don't. But because people who feel a cage closing around them do stupid, dangerous things, and Umbridge specifically has never once responded to pressure with anything resembling rationality." "I know," Harry said. "Good." She looked at the faint warmth at his jacket pocket. "Welcome back," she said, to Merlin. "I'm sorry it took this long for someone to let you out." "Thank you, Minerva," Merlin said, with a warmth that surprised her enough that it showed, briefly, in her eyes. Harry and Hermione walked out into a corridor that was getting lighter by degrees, and split at the staircase, her toward the flue in the entrance hall, him toward the grounds and the apparition point, and the castle was waking up around them, portraits stirring, suits of armor shifting their weight, the deep settling creak of very old stone moving through the transition from night into morning. "Harry," Hermione said, at the staircase. He looked back. "When you summoned him," she said. She was trying for casual and not quite managing it. "Were you scared?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "That's the thing. I wasn't scared at all." He paused. "I think I was more scared of what happened if I didn't." She nodded, in the particular way she had that meant she understood something she hadn't expected to. Then she went down the stairs and Harry went out into the morning. Ron Weasley opened the door of his flat above Weasley's Wizard Wheezes at 7:15 in a state that suggested he'd been up for about 45 seconds and had not yet interacted with coffee. He was in his dressing gown. His hair was doing something impressionistic. He looked at Harry on his doorstep and then at the space beside Harry where Merlin was currently manifesting at about half opacity in the early morning light, and his expression went through approximately 4 stages in 2 seconds. "Right," Ron said. "Come in. I'll put the kettle on." This was one of the things Harry loved most about Ron Weasley. The man had an extraordinary capacity to metabolize the impossible and come out the other side asking practical questions. Harry sat at Ron's kitchen table while Ron made tea with the focused attention of someone who understands that certain conversations require proper fortification first. Merlin sat across from Harry and looked around the flat with the expression of someone cataloging a new century, which he basically was. This was the first interior domestic space he'd observed from outside the wand, and the particular quality of his attention made Harry realize that the Elder Wand's perspective on a room was not the same as standing in it. "It's noisier than I expected," Merlin said, to no one in particular. "It's above a joke shop," Harry said. "I know. I meant," he gestured, vaguely, at the world. "Everything. The presence of magic that isn't active spellwork. He seemed to look for the word, denser. The whole environment is saturated in a way that wasn't true in my time. 1,500 years of accumulated magical residue," Harry said. "Like limestone in a pipe," Merlin agreed, with the tone of someone finding this technically interesting and personally slightly overwhelming. Ron put a mug in front of Harry, looked at Merlin for a moment, and then put a second mug in front of him on the grounds that the situation seemed to call for it. Merlin looked at the mug with something that was definitely appreciation and possibly also grief, in a way Harry didn't ask about. "So," Ron said, sitting down with his own tea and his very direct blue eyes. "What are we doing?" Harry told him. Ron listened with the stillness he brought to things that mattered. He saved the fidgeting and the commentary for things he was comfortable with, and when something was serious his attention went absolutely still and you had his whole self. He asked 2 questions during Harry's explanation, both of them precise. First, whether Kingsley knew yet, and second, what Umbridge's move would be once the challenge was filed. "Kingsley will know in about an hour," Harry said. "And Umbridge, she'll challenge the standing, the authenticity of the summoning, the legal basis of Article 7. She'll try to keep it procedural as long as possible and then, when that fails, she'll escalate." "Escalate how?" "That's what I want to figure out before we go to Kingsley." Harry looked at Merlin. Merlin had been watching Ron with the same assessing quality he'd given Hermione the night before. "The Preservation Council's strength is institutional," he said. "They control enough of the administrative infrastructure that standard challenges can be rerouted, delayed, buried in committee. The foundational challenge circumvents most of that, but it doesn't circumvent all of it. The areas where they retain the most control are," he counted, "the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, specifically the Classification and Records Office, the Wizengamot Appeals Committee, and the Flawed Network Authority." Ron looked up from his tea. "The Flawed Network Authority? They control who can flew where and when. It's not flashy but it's how you isolate people." Merlin said it with the flat certainty of someone who had watched this playbook before. "You cut off the ministry from the outside, you regulate communication between departments, and suddenly the minister can't convene an emergency session without going through 3 committees that you control." "They've already done this," Harry said. "They're already doing this," Merlin corrected. "The full implementation isn't complete yet or Kingsley would already be functionally irrelevant. They're about 60% there." He looked at Harry. "Filing the challenge today accelerates their timeline. They'll feel the pressure and move faster on the remaining 40%. Then we need to move faster," Ron said. "Yes," Merlin said, with the satisfaction of someone who has found the one other person in the room who immediately grasps the tactical geometry. "We do." They were at Kingsley's private residence, not the minister's official quarters in Whitehall, the actual flat he kept in a quiet corner of a Muggle neighborhood in Islington, which very few people knew about and which was therefore the safest place to have this conversation, by 8:30. Kingsley answered the door in shirt sleeves, saw Harry's face, and stepped back without a word. He was a large man with a stillness that Harry had always found quietly reassuring, not passive stillness, not defeated stillness, but the stillness of someone with enough interior resources that they didn't need external motion to feel solid. He'd been an Auror for 20 years before becoming minister, and it showed in the way he read a room, quick, thorough, and without drama. He read Merlin in approximately 2 seconds, glanced at the wand, looked at Harry, and said, "How long have you been planning this?" 3 months of research, Harry said. 1 night of actual planning. "What does the plan look like?" "Hermione is filing a foundational challenge to the Heritage Registration Act right now," Harry said. "We invoke Article 7, Merlin as original charter author, challenging on the basis that the Act violates the constitutive principles of the founding document." Kingsley was quiet for a moment. "They'll fight it." "Of course they will. I mean they'll fight it on every procedural and institutional level they have access to, Harry. The Oversight Board alone can create 6 months of delays, and if they get the Appeals Committee involved, we don't give them 6 months, Harry said. We file today, we request emergency Wizengamot session under Article 7 emergency provisions, which exist, Merlin has confirmed they've never been repealed, and we have the session within 72 hours. Kingsley looked at Merlin with a long, careful attention. "You can confirm the emergency provision standing?" "I can do more than confirm it," Merlin said. "I can articulate in specific detail every clause of the founding document that the Registration Act violates, in terms that no procedural delay can obfuscate, because I wrote those clauses and I am here to speak to their original intent." He paused. The Preservation Council has been using my work as a foundation for the exact opposite of what I built it to achieve. I find I have strong opinions about that. Kingsley held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to Harry. What do you need from me? The emergency session request has to come from the Minister. Only the Minister can invoke Article 7 emergency provisions, that's built into the Charter. Harry met his eyes. I know the Oversight Board is going to create problems. I know Umbridge is going to, the Oversight Board, Kingsley said, in a voice that was very calm and very final, does not have the constitutional authority to prevent a ministerial invocation of a founding charter provision. They're going to tell me they do, and they're going to use every procedural trick they have, but the actual charter, he glanced at Merlin, says otherwise. Doesn't it? The ministerial emergency provision is in Article 3, Merlin said. It predates the Oversight Board concept by 1500 years and takes absolute precedence over any subsequently created administrative body. This is not arguable. It is simply true. Something shifted in Kingsley's expression then. Harry had seen it before in the people he trusted most, McGonagall last night, Hermione when a plan clicked, Ron when the stakes became clear, the particular expression of someone who has been holding a wall up alone for a long time and has just been told there are more people on their side of it. He straightened. I'll file the session request by 10 o'clock. Don't go through the Ministerial Communications Office, Harry said. Direct submission to the Wisengamot clerk. Gawain Wimple, Kingsley said immediately. Hermione's already there with the foundational challenge documents. If you go in person, with the session request, and hand it to him yourself, I understand. Kingsley looked at Harry with the particular quality of attention that said he was assessing something and had reached a conclusion. You've thought about this carefully. I've had time. Most people your age, I know, Harry said. But I'm not most people my age, and honestly I've stopped apologizing for that. A brief, genuine smile from Kingsley. Good. He looked at Merlin again. Is he going to be all right? What you're asking him to do, standing in front of the Wisengamot, publicly, in a contested session that Umbridge will turn into a war, I think, Merlin said, with a dry warmth, you'll find he's rather good in a war. Yes, Kingsley said. I've noticed that. They left Kingsley's flat at 9 o'clock, Kingsley already pulling on his robes, and Harry and Ron stood on the pavement outside in the mild May morning while buses went by and Muggle London did Muggle things all around them, entirely unaware. Okay, Ron said. So. What now? Now we do the diagnostic. The what? Something Merlin suggested last night. Harry started walking. Ron fell into step beside him. Before we stand up in front of the Wisengamot, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. The full extent of it. Not the political picture, the actual, on-the-ground state of things. The Ministry, Diagon Alley, what's actually happening to Muggle-born families right now. He glanced at Ron. Merlin called it a diagnostic. Like checking the pulse of the patient before you operate, Merlin said, internally, in a tone that suggested he found the medical metaphor adequate if inelegant. Right, Ron said. So we're walking around looking at things. We're walking around looking at things, Harry confirmed. Why does this feel like it's going to be significantly worse than whatever I'm picturing? Because you're not picturing it badly enough, Harry said. They started at the Ministry. Not the main entrance, the phone box, which Harry had always found appropriately absurd as a metaphor for magical Britain's relationship with the Muggle world. They went in as visitors, which was itself instructive, because the visitor processing had changed since Harry's last visit and the changes were telling. The new intake procedure required a form documenting your magical bloodline for 3 generations, supposedly for security clearance purposes. The welcome which handed it across with the flat efficiency of someone who had processed it enough times not to think about it anymore. Harry took the form. Looked at it. Set it on the counter without filling it in. The welcome which looked at him. Harry looked back at her. It's mandatory, she said. Under what authority? Harry asked. She blinked. It was clearly not a question she'd been asked before. The Visitor Security Protocol, which was enacted under what legislative provision? Another blink. She reached for a binder. Ron leaned on the counter. Take your time. She found the reference. Read it to Harry. Harry listened to it, and then looked at Merlin, who was manifested faintly at his shoulder. That provision, Merlin said quietly, was originally a wartime security measure enacted in 1943. It has an automatic expiration clause requiring renewal every 5 years. He paused. It expired in 2002. No one renewed it. Harry looked at the welcome, which with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite anger but was somewhere between them. This procedure you've been running, he said, as gently as he could manage, has been legally void for 3 years. Nobody told you. She stared at him. I was told it was mandatory. I know, Harry said. That's the problem. They went up into the ministry. It was, and Harry had prepared himself for this, intellectually, but preparation and reality are different things, almost exactly what it had been before the war, in the way that a room can be restored to its pre-fire appearance while the smoke smell remains in the walls. The atrium was bright and the fountain had been rebuilt and people moved through it with the purposeful hurry of institutional routine. On the surface, it was a functioning government building. But he'd learned, in the last year, to look at the surface and also underneath it. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement occupied the 2nd floor. 3 months ago it had been under acting head Robards. Now there was a new brass plate on the door, Department Head, A. Thickness, reinstated. Harry stopped walking. Ron noticed. What? Thickness. Harry kept his voice level. He was the puppet minister. Under Voldemort. Under Imperius. Right, I remember, horrible, he's been reinstated. Harry's jaw tightened. Kingsley didn't know about this. How do you know Kingsley didn't? Because Kingsley would have told me. And because Kingsley would never have allowed it. Harry looked at the nameplate. This went around him. The Oversight Board, Merlin said quietly, internally. This is what they were building toward. Thickness knows every lever in that department. He has relationships there from before the war and deeper ones from during it. Reinstate him under a rehabilitation narrative and you have someone who can run the department as a second power center without ever openly defying the minister. Harry moved on. Not because it was fine, it was very far from fine, but because he needed the full picture before he reacted to any individual piece of it. The Department of Magical Creatures was under a new subcommittee structure that had divided its functions so granularly that effective policy had become impossible, 17 approval stages for any decision, each controlled by a different sub-office, producing a gridlock so thorough it looked accidental but wasn't. The Department of Magical Transportation, which administered the FLU network, had a new deputy head named Calloway who had been appointed without a standard confirmation process on the grounds of emergency staffing requirements that no one Harry asked could explain. The records office, Harry had saved this for last because Hermione had specifically flagged it, was in a basement level he'd never been to, a long corridor of filing cabinets that smelled of old parchment and something chemical he couldn't identify. The archivist on duty was a thin, careful man named Pembridge who looked at Harry with the precise mixture of recognition and apprehension that Harry had become familiar with. Mr. Potter, Pembridge said. I'd like to see the last 6 months of Wisengamot session records, Harry said. Full transcripts, attendance, voting records, and the committee appointment log. Pembridge looked at him. Looked at the wall behind Harry, which was the look people gave when they were calculating risk. Those records are, there's been a new protocol. Access to session records requires a level 4 clearance form, countersigned by 2 department heads. That protocol, Harry said, was enacted when? Pembridge checked. February. And before February? Session records were public. Open access. Right. Harry held Pembridge's gaze steadily. I'd like the records from before February, then. Pembridge hesitated for just a moment. Then he went to get them. Merlin was fully manifested now, standing beside Harry, reading the files as Pembridge laid them on the counter with the 4-second scanning quality Harry had noticed the night before. Here, he said, tapping a page that Harry had almost skimmed past. Appointment records, November and December. Harry looked. The Wisengamot appointment log for November showed 4 new seat confirmations. December showed 6. All 10 new appointments were to people with pure blood surnames Harry recognized, 2 Blacks, 3 Knots, 1 Rosier, and 4 names he didn't immediately know but whose family history Merlin, apparently, did. The Rosiers were a preserved council family in the 1600s, Merlin said. Before the council existed by that name, they were part of the original pure-blood consolidation movement that I spent 15 years fighting. He paused. Their family position has been consistent for 400 years. They've simply moved the language around. 10 appointments in 2 months. Harry did the arithmetic. 10 new seats out of 50 on the Wisengamot, that was a 20% addition to the Preservation Council's voting bloc, which had been at 30% before November. Now they were at 50%. They had a majority. Harry looked at that number for a long moment. They can pass anything, he said. With the current composition, yes, Merlin said. Including the Heritage Registration Act. It hasn't gone to full vote yet, Merlin said. Still in committee. But that's not caution, it's timing. They're waiting for something. For what? A pause. For Kingsley's position to be further eroded. They want the minister functionally unable to challenge the vote before they hold it. He looked at Harry. You filing the foundational challenge today disrupts that timing considerably. Good, Harry said. They left the ministry at noon and stood in the thin sunshine outside the phone box, and Ron ate a sandwich he'd somehow produced from his jacket pocket with the resourcefulness of someone who had learned in a tent in the Scottish wilderness that you never go anywhere without food, and Harry looked at Muggle London and Merlin stood slightly apart and looked at everything with that layered attention. You're angry, Harry said. Merlin didn't deny it. The classification office has been selectively purging records, he said. Not destroying them, they're too careful for that. But reclassifying. Documents that would show the historical precedent of pure-blood consolidation laws, records that would allow a constitutional historian to draw the direct line between this registration act and Voldemort's blood registry, and between that and every similar legislation going back 300 years, those documents have been quietly moved to restricted access. They're not just building a new structure, Harry said. They're erasing the history of the old ones. They're erasing the pattern, Merlin said. The most effective lie isn't the one that invents a new truth. It's the one that removes the evidence that the old truth ever existed. Ron finished his sandwich. This is properly bad. Yes, Harry said. Like, not just bad in the political sense. This is, Ron was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of quiet he brought to things that had gotten through his natural defenses. Fred died. My brother died. People died to stop exactly this, and here it is, just, he paused, dressed differently. There was nothing adequate to say to that, so Harry didn't try to say it. He put his hand on Ron's shoulder for a moment, briefly, and Ron nodded, and they stood in the sunshine without speaking for a little while. What's in Diagon Alley? Harry said eventually, to Merlin. Let's go see. The difference in Diagon Alley was subtler than the ministry, it was in the texture of the place rather than the structure. The shops were open, people were buying things, the leaky cauldron was doing lunch trade. But if you watched carefully, and Harry watched carefully, you could see it, the Muggleborn witch at Flourish and Blots who flinched when 2 men in expensive robes walked past her. The property in the middle of the alley that had changed hands twice in 6 months, both times to buyers with old pure-blood names, and was now a new office for a magical heritage consulting firm. The small, hand-lettered sign in the window of Madame Malkin's reading Certified Magical Ancestry Consultation Service, Inquire Within. Madame Malkin had been in business for 60 years. She'd fitted Harry for his first robes when he was 11. She'd fitted half the Death Eater's children for theirs too, because that was how commerce worked. She hadn't been political, had never been political, but here was this sign, in her window, offering ancestry consultations. Harry went in. Madame Malkin looked up. The recognition in her face was immediate, followed closely by something that was not quite guilt and not quite shame but was somewhere in the territory of both. "Mr. Potter," she said, "too bright." "The ancestry consultation," Harry said, looking at the sign. "When did you start offering that?" A pause. She smoothed her apron. "There's been a demand for it. People wanting to have their documentation in order before she stopped. "Before the Heritage Registration Act passes," Harry said. She didn't deny it. "I'm just a seamstress, Mr. Potter." I know," Harry said, and he kept his voice quiet. Not because he didn't feel anything but because the anger he felt wasn't for her, it was for the people who had created a climate where a 60-year-old seamstress felt she needed to offer genealogical documentation services to survive commercially. "Is there pressure on businesses here to carry these services?" She looked at him for a long time. Then, very quietly, the consulting firm that moved in. 3 doors up. They had a representative come round to all the established businesses in January. Very polite. Very professional. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone describing something threatening that they couldn't prove was threatening. They said that under the proposed act, businesses would need to demonstrate awareness of and support for the magical heritage framework in order to maintain their operating licenses. They said that explicitly. Not in writing. Her eyes met his. They never say anything in writing. Harry thanked her. He bought a pair of gloves he didn't need because it felt wrong to leave without buying something, and went back out into the alley. Ron and Merlin were waiting near the fountain. "Business licensing coercion," Ron said, because he'd been watching through the window. "Yes." Harry looked down the alley. The consulting firm's office had a brass sign, freshly polished, and 2 people visible through the window sitting at desks. "What's the firm called?" "Heritage Conservation Associates," Merlin said. He'd been reading the sign from here. "Registered in February." "Sole director," a pause, the quality of someone accessing a memory rather than reading, a Mr. Phineas Crabbe. "Crabbe," Ron said. "As in, a different branch of the family than the one you're thinking of," Merlin said. "Older money. Quieter. This particular family has been in the business of creating economic coercion structures for pure-blood consolidation since approximately 1680. Harry looked at the firm's office with the elder wand warm at his ribs and the full picture he'd assembled over the last 3 hours arranging itself in his mind with a clarity that was almost physical. This was the rot. Not just Umbridge's theatrical cruelty or Malfoy's cold strategic intelligence or even the Wisengamot's corrupted composition, it was all of these things together, interlocking, mutually reinforcing, a structure that existed at every level from the ministerial oversight board down to a handwritten sign in a seamstress's window. The same pattern, echoing at every scale, and each layer of it designed to make the layer above it invisible and the layer below it feel like common sense. "They're going to know by this afternoon," Harry said. Hermione's filed the challenge. Kingsley has submitted the emergency session request. Someone in the Wisengamot clerk's office is going to talk, or someone in Kingsley's shadow support staff is going to notice. Umbridge will know today. Yes, Merlin agreed. So what does she do? Merlin was quiet for a moment. Not the contemplative quiet of someone working through options, but something more specific, the quiet of someone who had watched power move in institutions for 1500 years and was running pattern recognition. "She'll do 3 things," he said finally. First, she'll attempt to have the challenge dismissed on procedural grounds before the session can be convened, probably within the next 12 hours. Second, she'll begin moving to consolidate the Wisengamot votes she doesn't fully control yet. There are still 7 seats in the moderate bloc that haven't committed. She'll be aggressive about securing those. Third, he paused. Third? Harry asked. She'll move against your allies. Not you, not directly, not yet. You're too visible, the optics are too dangerous. But the people around you are vulnerable, and isolating you is easier than challenging you directly. He looked at Harry. Kingsley is the obvious target. But I think, another pause, I think Ron's family is the more likely first move. Ron went very still. The Weasleys, Merlin continued, have been publicly anti-preservation council for decades. Arthur Weasley's position at the ministry has always been a minor thorn. Your brother works at the joke shop his late twin built, highly visible, profitable, associated with resistance. And there are younger members of the family in vulnerable positions. He looked at Ron. I'm sorry. These are the mathematics of this kind of power structure. They always go for the people the primary target loves. Right, Ron said. His voice was absolutely steady, which Harry knew was the thing that meant he was genuinely frightened. Then we get to them first. Yes, Harry said. We do. He turned to Merlin. You said 72 hours for the emergency session. What can we do in 72 hours? Merlin looked at him. The afternoon light caught his features and he looked, in that moment, unmistakably like someone who had been waiting a very long time to answer exactly this kind of question. We don't defend, Merlin said. We never had any intention of defending. We identified the rot, Harry. Now we start on the surgery. Harry felt it then, the particular quality of stillness that came just before a duel, just before a decision, just before something irreversible began. He'd felt it in the Forbidden Forest. He'd felt it on the bridge at Hogwarts. He felt it now, standing in Diagon Alley in the afternoon sun, with an ancient sorcerer at his shoulder and Ron beside him and the Elder Wand warm as something alive against his ribs, and somewhere across the city Hermione was placing documents on a desk in front of a proceduralist clerk who would process them regardless of their political content, and Kingsley was straightening his robes and going to do the thing that the cage around him had been built to prevent. Okay, Harry said. Let's go. Where? Ron asked. To warn your family. Harry started walking. And then, he said, we start making noise. Chapter 3, The first strike. The Wisengamot chamber was older than almost anything else in magical Britain, and it knew it. That was the feeling of it, not just the tiered stone seating that curved upward in a horseshoe around the central floor, not just the enchanted ceiling that showed the weather outside with parliamentary impartiality regardless of what was happening beneath it, but something in the quality of the silence between sounds. The chamber had absorbed 1,500 years of argument and decision and consequence, and the walls had opinions about all of it. Harry had been in it once before, as a 15-year-old being tried for underage magic, and he'd found it terrifying then. He found it clarifying now. He stood on the central floor, the spot where defendants stood, where petitioners stood, where, once in a great while, someone stood who was neither, and he looked up at the assembled Wisengamot and did not feel small. The chamber was full in a way that suggested the emergency session notice had done its job. 52 seats in the horseshoe, 51 of them currently occupied. The empty seat belonged to Griselda Marchbanks, who was 96 and had sent her formal proxy along with a note that Hermione had shown Harry this morning and which contained, in the handwriting of someone who had been examining students since before most of the room was born, the single sentence, about bloody time. The Preservation Council block occupied the right side of the horseshoe in the way that certain groups occupy space, consolidated, deliberate, radiating the specific confidence of people who have controlled the agenda for long enough that they've started to confuse control with legitimacy. Harry counted the seats. 19. One fewer than 20, which meant they'd lost one somewhere in the last 72 hours, and he filed that information away for later. Kingsley sat at the head of the chamber in the minister's chair, which was technically separate from the Wisengamot seating and symbolically significant for it. He sat with the straight-backed stillness of someone who has decided something and is done deliberating, and when his eyes met Harry's across the chamber floor they held a quality that Harry recognized from the best moments of the war, the look of someone who is, finally, doing the thing they should have been doing all along. Umbridge sat in the center of the Preservation Council block. Harry had not seen her since the trial, the real trial, after the war, the one where she'd been charged and somehow avoided anything more than a formal censure and a reduced pension. She looked, at first assessment, almost exactly the same, pink cardigan, neat hair, that smile that had always made Harry think of something sweet that had gone bad inside the wrapper. But there was something different in the quality of her composure this morning. The smile was present but the confidence underneath it had an edge of something else. Not fear exactly, Umbridge didn't do fear in the conventional sense. More like the expression of someone who has been forced to accelerate a plan they'd wanted to run on their own timeline. Good, Harry thought. Let her be accelerated. Beside her, and this was new, this was the thing that Harry had not anticipated and which Merlin had noted with a quiet intensity when they'd walked in, sat Lucius Malfoy. He had no seat on the Wizengamot. He was sitting in the public gallery on the lower tier, immaculately dressed, silver-headed cane resting against the railing, and he was watching Harry with the particular attention of a chess player watching an opponent make an unexpected opening move. Harry watched him back for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked away, because giving Lucius Malfoy more than 2 seconds of his attention was something he'd decided in advance he wasn't going to do. The chamber filled with the sound of 50 conversations happening at once, and then the head of the Wizengamot, a cautious man named Tiberius Ogden who had survived every political upheaval of the last 30 years by being genuinely difficult to classify, struck his gavel and the conversations collapsed into silence. This emergency session has been convened under Article 7 of the founding charter of the Wizengamot, Ogden said, with the flat precision of someone reading a document he'd studied very carefully before this morning. The session has been called by the Minister for Magic under Article 3 Ministerial Emergency Provisions and supported by a foundational challenge filed by, he checked his papers, one Hermione Jean Granger, on behalf of the Wand Master of Record, one Harry James Potter, challenging the Magical Heritage Registration Act on the grounds of constitutive violation. He looked up. The challenge further claims authorial standing under Article 7 on behalf of, a pause, the slight hesitation of someone about to say something unprecedented, the original author of this founding charter. The room had been attentive before. It went absolutely still now. Ogden looked at Harry. Mr. Potter. You may present your challenge. Harry stepped forward to the center of the floor. He'd talked with Merlin and Hermione until 2 in the morning about what this opening should look like. Hermione's instinct had been the legal argument first, build the procedural foundation, establish the standing, then bring in the authorial testimony. Merlin's instinct had been the opposite, establish the human reality first, then prove the legal violation. Harry had listened to both of them and then said what he actually thought, which was that you open with the thing that cuts through everything else, and what cuts through parliamentary procedure and legal precedent and 5 layers of institutional defense is truth delivered without decoration. I want to start, Harry said, by reading you something. He pulled a single sheet of parchment from his pocket. His voice was level and conversational, the way it got when he was completely serious. This is from the transcript of proceedings of the Muggleborn Registration Commission. The 17th of September, 1997. He read, Mary Cattermole, wand taken. Unable to account for magical ancestry to the Commission's satisfaction. Sentenced to Azkaban pending full review. Children to be assessed for placement. He folded the parchment. Mary Cattermole was 43 years old. She'd been a witch her entire life. She was found by an Auror, Arthur Weasley, sitting in this chamber today, hiding in a bathroom because she was afraid that her children would be taken. He let that sit. That was 1997. 8 years ago. He held up the Heritage Registration Act. This document requires all witches and wizards in Britain to file documentation proving 3 generations of magical ancestry. Failure to comply results in restriction of magical licensing, loss of employment in regulated magical professions, and classification review of magical status. He set it down on the floor. Someone in this chamber is going to tell me that these two things are not the same. And they're right that the language is different, and they're right that the punishment scale is different, and they're right that this version comes with a cultural heritage justification that the 1997 version didn't bother with. He looked up at the horseshoe. But I'd like them to explain the difference to Mary Cattermole's children. The silence in the chamber had a specific texture now. He could feel it. I'm not here to make a political argument, Harry continued. I'm here to make a constitutional one. This act violates the founding principles of this institution. Not my opinion of what those principles should be, the actual principles, as written, by the actual author, who I will now ask to speak. He reached into his jacket and took out the Elder Wand. The chamber did something Harry could only describe as intake of breath, not literally, not all at once, but a collective shift in the quality of attention that was almost physical. Every eye went to the wand. Even Umbridge's composure flickered, just for a fraction of a second, but Harry was watching for it. He held the wand up, not threateningly, not performatively, simply clearly, so everyone could see it, and said the short phrase in Old Gaelic that he and Merlin had settled on as the emergence key. 3 words, simple, grounded. Merlin came into the chamber like light coming through a window. Not dramatically. Not with fire or thunder or a crack of displaced air. He simply became present, standing beside Harry on the chamber floor, and the presence of him was, the word Harry kept coming back to was weight. The weight of someone who had been real for a very long time and whose reality had accreted layers that a normal human life didn't have time to accumulate. He looked around the chamber with the eyes of someone who had last stood in this space when its predecessor was a meeting of 12 druids in an oak grove, and whose expression reflected that gap without effort. The chamber was completely silent. Umbridge moved first, as Harry had known she would. She was on her feet before Merlin had been present for 10 seconds, and her voice was sweet and precise and absolutely furious underneath both qualities. "Headmaster Ogden," she said. "I must object to this presentation on the grounds that no legal standing has been established for," she gestured at Merlin with a delicacy that managed to be contemptuous, "this individual. The foundational challenge claims authorial standing under Article 7, but no authentication of identity has been provided. The chamber has no basis for, the authentication was filed with the challenge documents," Hermione said from the gallery, standing up. "Witnessed and sealed by Headmistress McGonagall of Hogwarts, whose institutional authority predates every certification body currently operating in this chamber. I can table the documents if you'd like to read them. The authentication procedure requires a Wisengamot-approved certifier, Article 2 of the Founding Charter," Merlin said, and his voice in the chamber was, not loud, but it had a quality of space that Harry noticed immediately, and apparently so did everyone else, because the rustle of movement that had started when Hermione stood up stopped cold. Article 2 establishes the precedence hierarchy for valid witnesses to charter-based claims. The first listed valid witness is an active headmaster or headmistress of Hogwarts School. The Wisengamot certification process you are citing was established in 1842 and therefore holds lower precedence than the Article 2 provision, which I wrote in 520 AD. He looked at Umbridge directly. "I'm afraid the hierarchy is not on your side in this matter." The silence that followed had a different quality from any of the others. Harry glanced up at the Preservation Council block and saw the rapid, low-voiced exchange happening between 3 of its members, not a confident exchange, a recalibrating one. Ogden leaned forward. "The authentication stands," he said. "The objection is noted for the record. Proceed." Umbridge sat down. Her smile was still present. Her eyes were doing something considerably less pleasant. "I am going to be specific," Merlin said, walking to the center of the floor in the way of someone who owns it, not because of power but because he built it. "I helped establish this institution when magic in this island was fragmented, contested, and at risk of extinction through its own internal conflicts. The purpose, the explicit, documented purpose, was to create a governing body that could manage magical affairs in Britain on the basis of magical ability and magical citizenship, with no distinction between the manner of a witch or wizard's birth. He stopped. That principle is in Article 1. It is the first principle. Not the fifth principle, not a qualifying clause, not a contextual provision. The first principle of this institution's existence is that magical citizenship is not a matter of ancestry. He let that sit. The Heritage Registration Act, he continued, is not a heritage preservation measure. It is a citizenship restriction mechanism. And I will tell you how I know this. He turned to face the full horseshoe. Because I know what a citizenship restriction mechanism looks like. I designed the legal framework for the first international magical cooperation agreements in the early 6th century. I spent 40 years in council with every significant magical governing body on this continent. And in every case where a governing body began to fail, and I watched several fail, it began exactly here. Not with violence, not with a coup, not with dramatic legislation. It began with the quiet re-establishment of the principle that some magical citizens counted more than others, dressed in the language of preservation and tradition and cultural continuity. He paused. I have watched this pattern play out 8 times in 1500 years. I am standing here because I would rather not watch it a 9th time. The chamber was so quiet that Harry could hear the candles. He was watching the moderate block, the 7 uncommitted seats that Umbridge had been working for the last 72 hours. 6 of them were watching Merlin with an attention that was not political calculation anymore. It was something rawer than that. The 7th was not looking at Merlin at all, which told its own story. Now, Merlin said, and his tone shifted from declarative to something more surgical. I want to address the specific constitutional violations. He walked them through it. Not the way Hermione walked through legal arguments, brilliantly, comprehensively, building a logical structure that was impossible to deny, but the way someone walks through their own house, identifying every room, knowing where every wall is because they put it there. He cited articles by their original text, not the revised versions. He named the provisions that the Heritage Registration Act violated, 4 of them, each articulated with a specificity that couldn't be challenged without challenging the document itself. He explained what had been changed and when and under what pretense, and with each example the picture assembled itself in the chamber with the clarity of something being held up to light. Halfway through, Umbridge was back on her feet. With respect to, she began. No, Harry said. She stopped. Looked at him. He's not finished, Harry said. The Elder Wand was in his hand and he wasn't doing anything with it except holding it, but the amber light was alive in it and the chamber could see that as clearly as he could. You'll have time to respond. He's not finished. A beat. Umbridge looked at Harry with the expression she'd given him in every detention, every disciplinary hearing, every moment where she'd held institutional power and expected him to flinch. She was waiting for that familiar dynamic to reassert itself. Harry looked back at her with nothing recognizable in his expression at all, and after 3 seconds she sat down. Merlin continued. He finished the constitutional violations and then moved into something Harry hadn't expected, a direct historical account of every similar piece of legislation that had been attempted in British magical history, from the 1600s onward, each one framed as cultural preservation, each one designed to accomplish the same citizenship stratification. He named the names. He cited the records. He drew the line between each piece of legislation and the next, including the most recent one, the blood registry under Voldemort. I am drawing this line explicitly, he said, because someone has been trying very hard to erase it. The Classification and Records Office of this ministry has reclassified approximately 40 historical documents relating to pureblood consolidation legislation over the last 8 months. I know this because I watched it happen. He looked at Harry for a fraction of a second, then back at the chamber. Those documents include the original 1740 Heritage Charter, the 1890 Ancestral Precedence Bill, and 3 separate internal ministry communications from 1996 and 1997 showing the direct legislative inheritance of Voldemort's blood registry from the earlier bills. He let that land. I am telling this chamber that the documents exist, where they are currently classified, and what they contain. The chamber may draw its own conclusions about why someone would want them inaccessible. The word someone in that sentence pointed at the Preservation Council block as clearly as a finger, and everyone in the room knew it. Lucius Malfoy, in the public gallery, was utterly still. His expression was pleasant and absolutely closed. Harry looked at him and Lucius looked back, and in those 2 seconds Harry understood that whatever happened in this chamber today, Lucius Malfoy had been playing a longer game than today for a very long time, and he was already 3 moves ahead of the move Harry had just made. That was fine. Harry was planning to keep moving. I yield to the chamber, Merlin said, and stepped back. Ogden looked, for a moment, like a man who has been told a mathematical proof he understood intellectually but not entirely emotionally, and needed a minute with both. Then he collected himself. The Preservation Council block may respond. Umbridge stood. And here was the thing about Umbridge, the thing Harry had learned at 15 and never forgotten: she was not stupid. The smile and the pink cardigan and the theatrical sweetness were not the absence of intelligence, they were intelligence deployed as camouflage. What stood up in the Wizengamot chamber now was someone who had been preparing a counter to this exact move for approximately 72 hours and had used those hours well. Members of the Wizengamot, she said, in the warm, measured tone of someone teaching a class to a room full of people she privately considers to be not very bright. What we have heard today is a remarkable performance. We have been presented with an individual claiming to be, quite literally, the most legendary figure in magical history, vouched for by a 19-year-old and his friends, on the basis of a magical procedure for which there is no precedent in British magical law. Also no prohibition, Hermione said from the gallery. Umbridge didn't look at her. The question the Wizengamot must ask itself is not whether the constitutional argument is internally consistent, it is. It's quite cleverly constructed. The question is whether this chamber intends to allow its foundational procedures to be invoked on the basis of evidence that cannot be independently verified. She paused, and the pause was perfectly timed. We cannot verify that this individual is who he claims to be. We have no mechanism for verification. We have a document signed by a Hogwarts headmistress and a young woman who is personally connected to the petitioner. Another pause. This is not a constitutional challenge. It is a political stunt. She sat down. The moderate bloc was watching her. Harry could see the effect, not that she'd convinced them, but that she'd given them a framework to retreat into if they wanted to, a procedural objection they could hide behind. Harry looked at Merlin. Merlin looked at the chamber with an expression of almost serene patience. I have been challenged on the grounds of authentication, he said. Fair enough. Let me demonstrate. He raised his hand. Nothing in the gesture was dramatic, it was the gesture of someone pointing at something obvious, and the magic that came out of it was nothing Harry had ever seen before. Not a spell, not a charm, not anything with a Latin root or a wand motion. It was more fundamental than that, the way that grammar is more fundamental than vocabulary. It touched the chamber at the level of its structure. Every ward in the room responded. The foundations of the Wizengamot chamber lit up along their original inscription lines, not literally, not visibly to every person in the room, but to those who could feel magic at its structural level, which included most of the people in the chamber, it was unmistakable. Like pressing your hand against a wall and feeling the vibration of the engine that's always been running inside it. Those are my wards, Merlin said, into the silence that followed. I laid them in 522 AD. They are inscribed in the magical substrate of this floor in a style that predates every subsequent warding tradition by 3 centuries and is not taught in any school because the knowledge was lost with me. He looked at Umbridge pleasantly. If there is an independent authenticator in this chamber who would like to examine the ward structure and compare it to the oldest records of my known magical signature, I am happy to wait. The silence was a specific kind. Umbridge's smile was still present. Her jaw, Harry noticed, had tightened by approximately 2 millimeters. Point of order, said a voice from the moderate bloc. Everyone looked. A small, round-faced witch named Griselda Flitter, whose seat Harry had clocked as undecided, was on her feet looking slightly as though she couldn't believe she was standing up, but standing up nonetheless. I would like to propose that an independent authenticator be brought in. Not as a delay tactic. She looked at Umbridge with a clarity that was quite pointed. As the procedure we should have been following from the beginning if the authentication submitted by Headmistress McGonagall wasn't sufficient, which, given the arguments I've just heard, I'm increasingly inclined to think it was. 3 other members of the moderate bloc nodded. Umbridge was on her feet before the nod finished. The authentication procedure for a foundational challenge requires, Article 2, said one of the moderate members flatly. A man named Crispin Folly who had the look of someone who had just decided to stop being polite. We just heard what Article 2 says, Dolores. Unless you're disputing the original text. I am disputing the identity of the individual claiming to speak to the original text, which is what the independent authenticator would address, Folly said. I second the point of order. Ogden was looking at his papers. He looked up at Umbridge. Then at Merlin. Then at Harry, with an expression that said quite clearly that this was the most interesting session he'd presided over in 30 years and he was going to handle it correctly regardless of what it cost him. The point of order is valid, Ogden said. This session will recess for 2 hours while the chamber's designated authenticator examines the ward structure. Session will resume at, he checked, 4 o'clock. He raised his gavel. One moment, Harry said. Ogden paused. Mr. Potter. Before we recess. Harry looked up at the full chamber. I'd like to bring one more thing to the chamber's attention. Something that doesn't require authentication. He pulled a second sheet from his pocket and held it up. This is a report from Diagon Alley Businesses, compiled in the last 48 hours, detailing visits from representatives of Heritage Conservation Associates, a firm registered in February of this year, informing business owners that their operating licenses would be reviewed under the Heritage Registration Act if they could not demonstrate support for the Magical Heritage Framework. He paused. Business licensing coercion. Preemptive, informal, unlegislated. He looked at the chamber directly. This act isn't waiting to pass. It's already operating. The infrastructure is already in place. The mechanism is already running. He put the paper down. I thought the chamber should know. Ogden struck his gavel. Recess. 4 o'clock. The chamber broke up with the specific energy of a room that has been holding something in, and the moment the gavel came down it all released at once, voices, movement, people crossing the floor to talk to people they'd been looking at across the room for the last 2 hours. Harry watched Umbridge move to the Preservation Council block in the compact, urgent exchange that was happening in their cluster, posture tight, voices low. Lucius Malfoy had already left the gallery. Harry noted the absence with the particular attention he gave to things that were moving when they should be still. Ron appeared at his elbow from the visitors' gallery, navigating the chamber floor with the ease of someone who has played Quidditch and therefore understands physical space. That was, I mean. He gestured at the room. How are you so calm? I'm not, Harry said, putting the Elder Wand back in his jacket. I'm just better at not showing it than I used to be. Hermione arrived on his other side with her folder, which had grown significantly thicker since this morning and was held together with a permanent sticking charm and what appeared to be a physical rubber band. 4 of the moderate block are going to come over, she said quietly, before Harry could ask. Flitter and Folly we just saw. Dimphna Tuck was nodding throughout Merlin's presentation. She taught constitutional history at Beauxbatons for 12 years before her appointment. She knows the founding document better than anyone in this chamber except, she glanced at Harry's jacket, well. And Hadrian Lovell is undecided but he's Muggle-born and the Registration Act affects him personally, which means he was always a soft yes for us. That's 4, Harry said. Plus the 19 we already have, wait, 18. They lost 1. Theodore not the Elder withdrew from the Preservation Council block this morning, Hermione said. I don't know why yet. Possibly genuine conscience, Possibly he's reading the political weather and switching sides before the storm arrives. Can we trust him? On this specific vote, probably. On anything longer term, I wouldn't. Harry looked around the chamber. Kingsley had stepped down from the minister's chair and was speaking to Ogden in a low, serious exchange that from the body language looked productive. Kingsley's working Ogden, Harry noted. Good, Hermione said. We need Ogden solid. He can delay or advance procedural matters in ways that will matter enormously in the next 2 hours. She pulled a paper from her folder. Also, this arrived by owl during the session. She handed it to Harry. It's from Arthur Weasley. Harry read it. It was short. Someone tried to access our FLU connection from the FLU Network Authority at 11:17 this morning. I've disabled the external connection on our end. Tell Ron I've moved his mother and Ginny to Bill's. All fine, but you were right. Harry showed it to Ron, who read it and said nothing for a moment, then said, right, in a voice that was very steady. I was hoping I was wrong, Harry said. Were you actually? No, Harry admitted. Merlin was standing apart from all of this, in the middle of the chamber floor, looking at the walls. Not the people, the walls. Harry walked over to him. The warding responded more strongly than I expected, Merlin said, without turning. 1,500 years and it's still fully functional. I wondered if it would be degraded. It wasn't, Harry said. No. He looked at Harry. The authenticator will confirm. That's not what concerns me. What concerns you? Lucius Malfoy left immediately, Merlin said. The moment the session recessed. He didn't go to Umbridge's group. He didn't speak to anyone. He simply left. Harry had noticed. Yes. In my experience, Merlin said, when the most strategically capable person in a room leaves at the moment their side is losing, it means they are not investing in the current battle. It means they are doing something else. Preparing the next one, Harry said. Or ending this one by a different means. Merlin looked at him steadily. He was in the gallery as a public observer. He has no formal Wisengamot role. He doesn't need one, Harry said. He has money, old alliances, and people in the classification office who've been reclassifying documents for 8 months. What would you do, if you were him and the constitutional challenge was going well for us? Merlin was quiet for 3 seconds. I'd make the challenge irrelevant, he said. Not defeat it on the merits, circumvent it. If the Wisengamot votes to uphold the challenge and annul the act is finished. But if the act somehow passes before the vote, he'd need the committee to emergency certify it, Harry said, already moving. Skip the standard session, push it through the legislative committee as an emergency measure before our challenge can be ruled on. He was pulling out his mirrors before the sentence finished. Two-way mirror, the new ones Hermione had made last summer, he had one, Ron had one, and they'd given a third to Arthur Weasley last week with the specific instruction to check it if anything strange happened at the ministry. He held it up. Arthur. The mirror surface rippled. Arthur Weasley's face appeared, slightly disheveled, clearly somewhere he'd retreated to for privacy. Harry. I was just about to, the legislative committee, Harry said. Are they in session right now? A pause. Arthur's expression confirmed it before he spoke. An emergency certification meeting was called 40 minutes ago. I'm not on the committee, I found out by accident, one of the clerks in my department mentioned it. Harry, if they push the act through emergency certification, it bypasses our challenge, Harry said. I know. Who called the meeting? The committee chair. Penelope Broadmoor. Arthur paused. Harry, Malfoy was seen in her office 20 minutes ago. Harry looked at Ron. Ron was already moving toward the chamber exit. We need to stop that meeting, Harry said. The session reconvenes in 2 hours, Hermione said, coming over with the precision of someone who had heard enough to update her entire tactical picture. If the act gets emergency certification before 4 o'clock, then we're challenging something that's already law, Harry said. Which is a much harder position. He was thinking fast. Hermione, what are the grounds for invalidating an emergency certification? She was already in her folder. Emergency certification requires genuine urgency, a credible immediate harm that necessitates bypassing standard process. It's a very high bar. Or it requires certification quorum, 6 of the 9 committee members present and consenting. If the quorum isn't met, how many of the 9 are in this building right now? Harry asked. Hermione's eyes went distant in the way they did when she was running through information. The session was called for the full Wisengamot. Most committee members are also Wisengamot members. She grabbed her folder. Committee composition, Broadmoor chairs, that's 1. Seating records show Aldous Fenwick checked in this morning, 2. Matilda Cross, 3. She was counting. Umbridge is a non-voting committee observer but she doesn't count for quorum. They need 6. She looked up. If there are fewer than 6 present at that committee room, the certification fails on quorum, Harry said. How do I find the committee room? Level 4, Ron said, who had apparently already been to the Ministry Directory Board by the chamber entrance. Room 7B. Harry was across the chamber floor before Hermione finished saying, "Be careful," which she did say, and he heard it, and he kept moving. The level 4 corridor was quieter than the atrium, the particular quiet of a floor that people worked on rather than passed through. Harry knew the ministry well enough now to move through it with the purposeful confidence that gets you past most attention. People in corridors don't stop people who look like they know where they're going. Ron was 2 steps behind him and Merlin was fully manifested and walking beside him, and Harry noticed with a sideways appreciation that Merlin walked through a ministry corridor with the calm absolute authority of someone who built the legal framework for the institution and is mildly unimpressed by what was done with it. Room 7B had a closed door and a murmur of voices behind it. Harry opened it. 7 people around a table, documents in front of them, quills moving. They looked up. Harry looked at them. He looked at the documents on the table, the Heritage Registration Act certification paperwork, half-signed. He looked at Broadmoor, who was chair, who was a sharp-faced woman in her 60s with the alert stillness of someone who has just been caught doing something she's technically allowed to do and is recalibrating. He looked at the door to the side corridor, through which a 9th person had apparently just left, because the chair at the far end was still warm and there was a cup of tea half-drunk beside it. 7, Harry said. You have quorum. Mr. Potter, Broadmoor said, with the professional composure of someone buying time to think. This is an emergency committee meeting and therefore, closed to observers under which provision? Harry said. Because emergency certification meetings are closed only if the subject matter is classified at level 5 or above, and the Heritage Registration Act is publicly available legislation. He looked at the documents in front of her. What is the urgent harm justifying emergency certification? Broadmoor looked at her papers. There are ongoing, what is the urgent harm, Harry repeated, not louder, just clearer. Specifically. You are certifying emergency status for a piece of legislation that bypasses the standard legislative review process, which requires a specific credible immediate harm. I'm asking you to name it. A pause. The silence in the room had the specific texture of people who have been caught following instructions from someone who isn't in the room and are not sure how to defend the instructions without naming the person who gave them. The certification hasn't been completed, said one of the committee members, Aldous Fenwick, a heavy-set man who looked as though he was reconsidering a great many decisions simultaneously. We haven't signed. No, Harry said. You haven't. He looked around the table. 7 people who were, in their private lives, probably a mixed group, some true believers, some pragmatists, some people who had gotten onto this committee through the same appointment process that had put thickness back in law enforcement and who were not necessarily thrilled about where they'd ended up. He needed to give the pragmatists somewhere to go. The Wisengamot is in session today because of a foundational challenge to this act, Harry said. If emergency certification proceeds, the certification itself becomes subject to legal challenge, because emergency status requires demonstrated urgency and, he looked at Hermione, who was behind him in the doorway with her folder open. Section 14 of the Legislative Procedure Charter, Hermione said, without looking up. An emergency certification made during an active foundational challenge session is automatically subject to suspension pending resolution of the challenge, and any signatory to the certification becomes personally liable for procedural misconduct if the challenge is upheld. Personally liable, Harry said. He watched that land on 7 faces. I have never, said Matilda Cross, a small woman at the end of the table who had the expression of someone who has been waiting for someone to say something out loud for several months, been comfortable with this process. She put down her quill. I think I'd like to consult the session proceedings before we go any further. Fenwick put his quill down. 2 others followed. Broadmoor sat with her quill in her hand and her jaw set, and she looked at Harry with the controlled fury of someone who has just had a key piece removed from a very intricate mechanism, and said, "This isn't over." "No," Harry agreed. "It isn't. It'll be over at 4 o'clock, when the chamber votes." He held her gaze. "I'd recommend sending your quill back to whoever gave you it." He left room 7B with Ron and Hermione and Merlin, back into the level 4 corridor, and the moment the door was closed behind them Ron exhaled. "The Malfoy thing," Ron said. "That was Malfoy's move." "One of them," Harry said. He kept walking. "That one failed. He has others. Are we going to be ready for them?" Harry glanced at Merlin. "We are going to finish the session," Merlin said, with the quality of someone who has identified the remaining obstacles on a path and found them surmountable. "What happens after is what we need to prepare for." "What happens after is that they lose the vote," Hermione said, "and then they have to decide whether to accept the constitutional ruling or fight it outside the chamber." "They'll fight it outside the chamber," Harry said. "Obviously," Merlin agreed. "So we should expect, what? In the next 48 hours?" "In the next 48 hours, Merlin said carefully, I would expect them to attempt 3 things. First, a legal challenge to Ogden's jurisdiction to run this session. Second, a public narrative campaign framing the challenge as foreign interference or political manipulation, something that distances the content from the constitutional argument. Third," he paused. "Third?" Ron asked. "Something personal," Merlin said. "The first 2 are institutional. The third will be personal. It always is, when people in this position feel the ground moving." They were back at the chamber entrance. Through the doors Harry could hear the chamber refilling as the recess ended, the sound of 50 conversations moving toward something. He felt it again, that clarifying stillness. "Let's go win the vote," he said. The 4 o'clock session was shorter, faster, and decisive in the way that sessions rarely are when they are conducted on the basis of procedure and precedent rather than political calculation. The independent authenticator, a small, ancient wizard named Theophilus Rake who had been the Wisengamot's designated magical forensics expert for 30 years and had the reputation of being constitutionally incapable of producing a verdict that wasn't accurate, examined the ward structure in the chamber floor for 40 minutes while the room watched, and then stood up and said, in the tone of someone reporting a mathematical result, "The ward structure is consistent with 6th century craftsmanship, composed in a style that is documented in the Bodleian Archives collection of pre-Hogwarts magical manuscripts as attributable to a single practitioner, known in historical records as," he paused, and his voice carried a fractional weight, "Merlin Emery's. The magical signature is a match. There is no fraudulent element in the construction." The moderate bloc voted for the challenge. The full vote was 31 to 18 in favor of upholding the foundational challenge and annulling the Heritage Registration Act pending constitutional review. Not the elder voted with the majority, which meant even the Preservation Council bloc had a crack in it. Umbridge stood for the recorded opposition vote and her expression was the specific quality of someone who has lost a battle and is already in the next one. She did not look at Harry. She looked at the doors. Kingsley, from the minister's chair, signed the formal annulment with a deliberateness that Harry felt across the chamber floor. Ogden struck his gavel. It rang through the chamber and through 1,500 years of accumulated argument and decision, and the walls absorbed it, like they had absorbed all the others, and the records clerk wrote it down, and outside the enchanted ceiling the London sky was going orange with late afternoon, and it was done. Harry stood on the floor of the chamber as people moved around him, and he looked at the elder wand in his hand, and it was warm, and the amber light in it was the steadiest it had ever been. "One piece," Merlin said quietly, beside him. "How many more?" Harry asked. "Many." Merlin looked around the chamber. But this one mattered. Not just tactically. This one, he paused, considering, this one reminded the institution that it has principles it's been violating. That's harder to walk back from than any political position. Ron came and stood beside Harry, shoulder to shoulder. "Now what?" Harry pocketed the wand. "Now," he said, "we find out what they do next." Outside the chamber doors, somewhere in the ministry that was already shifting around this result like water finding a new channel, Lucius Malfoy was thinking several moves ahead. And Harry, for the first time in a long time, was not afraid of that. Chapter 4, When the ground fights back. The Owl arrived at Grimmauld Place at 6:30 in the morning, 2 days after the Wisengamot vote. Harry was already awake. He'd been awake since 4, which was a habit left over from the war that he hadn't managed to shake, and he was in the kitchen with tea and the previous 3 days' worth of daily profits spread across the table when the tapping came at the window. He let the Owl in and took the letter, and the Owl left with the urgency of something that had been flying fast and wanted to keep moving. The letter was from Kingsley. 3 sentences. Thickness moved against the classification office last night. Pembridge is gone, suspended on misconduct grounds. The documents you accessed during the diagnostic have been reclassified to level 6. Come now, and don't come through the flu. Harry read it twice, then once more, then folded it into his pocket and went upstairs to get dressed. He was out the front door by 6:45, walking fast through the grey Islington morning, and he operated from the corner of the street where no one was watching to the alley behind the small café in Whitehall that Kingsley used as a discreet entry point when he didn't want to be seen going into or out of ministry-adjacent buildings. He arrived to find Ron already there, leaning against the wall with his collar up against the early chill and the expression of someone who had also been awake for a while. "Got the letter too?" Harry asked. "Dad sent me one at the same time." Ron straightened. He was there when Pembridge got suspended. Said it happened in about 10 minutes, 2 law enforcement officers, a written notice of suspension, and they had him out of the building before anyone in the records office could do anything. "Misconduct grounds," Harry said. Apparently he allowed unauthorized access to restricted documents. Ron's voice was entirely flat. "Which is what they're calling you, reading public session records and a 3-year-old heritage charter that should have been accessible to anyone." "They couldn't go after me directly," Harry said. "So they went after him." "Yeah." Ron paused. "He's got a family, Harry. 3 kids. Pembridge." Harry knew. He'd looked it up, automatically, in the way he'd learned to look things up, knowing the full shape of the consequences before they happened, so he wasn't standing in front of them unprepared. He felt it the way he felt most things these days, clearly and without flinching, and with a specific quality of anger that wasn't hot anymore but cold and very, very focused. "He's not going to lose his job permanently," Harry said. "We'll make sure of that." "How?" "Same way we did everything else. We move faster than them." He looked at Ron. "Where's Hermione?" "Said she'd meet us inside." "She's been up since 3 apparently." "Of course she has." Kingsley was waiting for them in a ministry conference room that Harry had never been to before, which was itself a sign of how seriously Kingsley was taking operational security. This room was 2 floors below the main administrative level, accessible through a maintenance corridor, and had been swept for monitoring spells so recently that the air still had the faint ionist quality of a detection charm finishing its cycle. Arthur Weasley was there. So was McGonagall, which meant Kingsley had sent a separate owl to Hogwarts at some point during the night. And Hermione was in the corner with her folder and 3 additional notebooks, and the expression she got when she'd been working through a problem for several hours and had reached conclusions she wasn't happy about. Merlin was manifested beside Harry before he'd fully crossed the threshold, which was increasingly how it worked. The situations that were serious seemed to pull him into presence the way a strong current pulls at anything floating. Kingsley stood at the head of the table. He looked like someone who had not slept but had not allowed that to matter. "Thank you for coming quickly. Here's where we are." He didn't waste time on preamble, which was one of the things Harry respected most about him. Thickness suspended Pembridge at 11 last night under a misconduct notice that bypassed the standard HR review process. The documents you accessed during the diagnostic, the session records, the appointment log, and the 6 restricted historical documents that Pembridge pulled for you, have been reclassified to Level 6. Level 6 requires direct ministerial authorization for access. "You could deauthorize it," Harry said. "I tried." Kingsley's voice was level. The Oversight Board convened an emergency meeting at midnight and passed a resolution restricting the minister's unilateral authority to alter security classifications above Level 4 on the grounds of, he checked his notes, with the expression of someone reading something that is technically legal and deeply wrong, operational security concerns during an active constitutional review period. "They used our challenge as the justification," Hermione said, from the corner. "The constitutional review we triggered is the active review period they're citing as grounds to restrict Kingsley's authority." "They turned our own move against us," Ron said. "They tried to," Harry said. He looked at Kingsley. "The Oversight Board's resolution, what's the constitutional basis?" "That's where it gets interesting," Hermione said, standing up. She was in her professional mode, which meant she was moving while she talked and not entirely registering that other people were sitting down. "The Oversight Board's authority comes from the Ministerial Support Act of December last year. That act was passed by the Wisengamot in a session that," she opened her folder to a specific page with the precision of someone who has bookmarked the exact right thing, included 9 of the 10 new appointments that were made between November and December. Appointments that were made to seats that previously belonged to people who were removed on technicalities during the post-war administrative reorganization. "The seats are illegitimate," Merlin said. Everyone looked at him. "If the appointments are contestable, the act they voted for is contestable. And if the act is contestable, the Oversight Board that act created is contestable. Which means the resolution they passed last night is contestable," Harry said. "Everything is a thread," Merlin said, and there was a satisfaction in his voice that was not cruel but was very precise. "Pull the right one and the whole structure moves." "The appointment process," Arthur said, leaning forward. He had the quiet, persistent intelligence of someone who had worked in a bureaucracy for 30 years and understood exactly how it moved. "The people who were removed from those seats, on what grounds?" "Administrative regularization," Hermione said. "Post-war procedural review. Most of them were people who'd had their service interrupted during Voldemort's occupation and were technically in a category that required reconfirmation of appointment." She paused. "Nobody reconfirmed them. Their seats were declared vacant. Then 10 new appointments filled those and other vacancies." "Were the original seat holders informed of the requirement to reconfirm?" McGonagall asked. "That," Hermione said, "is exactly the right question." She pulled another page. 3 of the 10 were. 7 were not. The notification requirement is in the Wisengamot Seat Continuity Regulations from 1923, and it's non-negotiable. You cannot declare a seat vacant for failure to reconfirm if you didn't send the reconfirmation notice. She looked at the room. 7 of the 10 appointments are legally invalid. The silence that followed was the productive kind. 7 invalid appointments, Harry said. That removes 7 seats from the Preservation Council block. Which takes them from 18, after Nott's defection, to 11, Hermione said. Out of 52. They no longer have a blocking minority, let alone anything approaching a majority. And the Ministerial Support Act they passed with those invalid seats, Kingsley began. Falls with them, Merlin said. A legislative act passed with an improperly constituted voting body is voidable under the founding charter's legislative integrity provisions. He looked at Kingsley steadily. Article 11. The one they never amended because they didn't think anyone would connect it to the appointment process. The Oversight Board, Kingsley said, and his voice had a quality Harry hadn't heard in it before, not relief exactly, but the sound of something that had been under pressure for months and has just found a release point. If the Ministerial Support Act is void, the Oversight Board has no constitutional basis. None whatsoever, Merlin confirmed. We need to file this today, Harry said. It's already drafted, Hermione said, to absolutely no one's surprise. McGonagall made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood of one. There's something else, Kingsley said, and the gravity in his voice brought the room back to attention. He looked at Harry. Pembridge wasn't the only one. 3 other ministry employees were served with notices last night. All 3 had interaction with your party during the diagnostic. A welcome which named Dawes, an archivist from the Fleur Records office, and, he checked, Matilda Cross. Harry went still. Cross voted against the certification in room 7B. She's been suspended pending review of her conduct during the emergency certification meeting. They're calling it procedural interference. Kingsley's eyes met Harry's. She did the right thing. She's paying for it. Is she safe? Ron asked. Physically, yes. Her suspension is administrative. But she's an older woman, no family in the ministry, and she's been quietly terrified since the notice arrived, according to my source. Kingsley paused. These aren't the moves of people who are strategically planning their next institutional battle, Harry. These are the moves of people who are frightened and retaliating. That's different. It's faster and less rational. Malfoy, Merlin said, and he said it with the confidence of someone identifying a pattern they've seen before. He's no longer running the strategy. When an intelligent strategist loses control of the pace, the operation fragments. Umbridge is making retaliatory moves on her own timeline. Malfoy has either lost control of her or has decided to step back and let her burn while he repositions. You think he's distancing himself from the Preservation Council? Arthur asked. I think he's a man who has survived 2 Dark Lords and several political reversals by knowing exactly when to stop being associated with a losing position. Merlin looked at Harry. Which means the council is going to become more erratic and more dangerous in the short term. And it means whatever Malfoy is doing instead, we can't see it yet. Harry absorbed this. Okay. Priorities. He counted on his fingers. First, Hermione files the appointment challenge today, same process as the foundational challenge, direct to Ogden, invoke the seat continuity regulations. Second, Pembridge and Cross and the others get legal support immediately. Hermione, I have 3 names, Hermione said. Magical employment law specialists, all of them clear of Preservation Council connections. I'll contact them this morning. Third, Harry said, we need to know where Malfoy is. The room was quiet for a moment. He hasn't been seen at the ministry since the session, Arthur said. I've asked around quietly. He left the building after the emergency certification confrontation, and no one's seen him in ministry premises since. His estates, McGonagall said. Malfoy Manor is the obvious retreat when he's repositioning. But his actual operational network doesn't run through the manor, it runs through the old pure-blood social infrastructure. The Wizarding Genealogical Society, the Foundational Families Consortium, the Heritage Conservation Endowment Funds. She paused. These are the institutions that educated people stop paying attention to because they seem purely ceremonial. They're not ceremonial, Merlin said. No, McGonagall agreed. They're the places where decisions get made before they arrive in rooms like this. Harry looked at Arthur. Can you find out if there's been any unusual activity in those organizations in the last 72 hours? I can try, Arthur said. I have one contact in the consortium, decent man, old family but independent-minded. He might talk. Don't push him into anything uncomfortable, Harry said. We need people like him to remain able to operate. Arthur looked at Harry with the particular warmth he sometimes turned on him, not paternal exactly, more like the look of someone watching a person they've known since childhood make a decision that confirms something they always believed about them. I know, Harry. The meeting broke up at 8, people moving with the specific purpose of people who have a clear list and limited time. Harry stayed at the table for a moment after the others left, and Merlin sat across from him, and the room was quiet. The retaliations, Harry said. Pembridge, Cross, the others, they're meant to send a message. Yes, Merlin said. They want me to slow down. Get cautious. Start worrying about who else gets hurt. Yes. And the correct response to that is, to move faster, Merlin said. And to take care of the people they've gone after, so that their message lands as, we do this and Harry Potter fixes it. Which is significantly less useful to them as a deterrent. He paused. You already knew this. I wanted to hear you say it, Harry said. Because the other voice in my head, the one that says, slow down and no one else gets hurt, is very persuasive when I'm tired. That voice is not wrong that people get hurt, Merlin said. It's wrong about the solution. The people already getting hurt, Pembridge's family, Cross sitting at home frightened, they got hurt because the structure is rotten, not because you started challenging the structure. Stopping doesn't protect them. It just lets the rot continue to a point where there are more of them. He met Harry's eyes directly. You know this. You've known it for a long time. Yeah, Harry said. I have. He went to find Ron. The morning was full. Hermione filed the appointment challenge by 9:30, with the same directness and procedural precision she'd brought to everything else, and Ogden, who had apparently decided, after the previous session, that his job was to run a constitutionally correct Wisengamot and not to manage the politics of what that required, accepted it without delay and scheduled a review hearing for the following morning. The legal support for Pembridge and Cross and the others was arranged by 10. By 11 Harry had confirmation that Pembridge's suspension had been contested formally and that the misconduct charge, which rested on a procedure that was itself legally questionable, was already wobbling. What Harry did not anticipate was the Daily Prophet. The afternoon edition hit the Ollery at 2:30 and Ron brought it upstairs to the Grimmauld Place drawing room where Harry and Merlin and Hermione had reconvened to work through the appointment challenge supporting documentation, and he held it up without saying anything because sometimes a headline was its own complete communication. Potter's puppet, is Merlin real, or is Britain's hero playing the oldest trick in the book? The article was 3 pages long, which was unusual. It had been written by a journalist named Cassandra Vane whom Harry vaguely recognized as having been on the fringes of Skeeter's circle, not Skeeter's level of creative dishonesty, but operating in the same tradition of presenting insinuation as investigation. The argument, stripped of its rhetorical decoration, was this, that Harry had fabricated or conjured a false presence using the Elder Wand's power, that no authentic summoning of a historical figure was possible, that the Article 7 claim was therefore fraudulent, and that the constitutional challenge was a politically motivated performance by someone who had, this was the sentence Harry read 3 times, never stopped seeking the power and attention that his defeat of Voldemort placed temporarily within his reach. Temporarily, Ron said, reading over Harry's shoulder. The actual gall, they had to answer the authentication, Hermione said, sitting up and pulling the paper toward her. She was reading fast. Rake's verdict was public record and unimpeachable. They can't argue the ward forensics, so they're arguing the interpretation. They're saying Rake authenticated the wards, but that doesn't prove the entity who produced them is genuinely Merlin, could be a constructed magical identity, a very sophisticated glamour, or a deliberate misdirection. And the ward style predating every subsequent tradition by 3 centuries? Harry asked. They're not engaging with that specific point, Hermione said. Which is telling. Harry looked at Merlin. Merlin was reading the paper with the expression of someone encountering a rhetorical tradition that is simultaneously new in its specifics and entirely familiar in its pattern. This argument, he said. It could be a construct angle. It's not actually about authentication. It's about your character, Harry. The wording there, he tapped the never stop seeking power line, that's designed to make every action you take from this point forward legible as self-interested. You challenge the Heritage Act, that's power seeking. You protect Pembridge, that's maintaining your public image. Whatever you do, the narrative frame interprets it as ego. Yeah, Harry said. Rita Skeeter ran this exact playbook when I was 14. Different details, same structure. Who gave this to the prophet? Ron asked. It doesn't have a source listed, Hermione said. Background briefings. Malfoy, Harry said. This is what he's been doing since he left the session. He's not running institutional strategy anymore, he's running public narrative. If he can't beat the constitutional argument on its merits, he makes the constitutional argument feel like it's about me rather than about the law. Hermione was already writing. We need a response. Not defensive, proactive. We don't answer the question of whether you're seeking power. We make that question irrelevant by making the stakes of the constitutional challenge so clear that your personal motivations are beside the point. Interview, Ron said. Harry looked at him. You hate interviews, I know. But, not an interview, Harry said. Something better. He thought for a moment. Merlin. Merlin looked up from the paper. Would you write something? Harry said. Not through me, not filtered through a legal document. Just, your own account. Of what you built and what it's become. In your own voice. Merlin was quiet for a moment. You want me to speak directly to the public. The prophet won't print it, obviously. But Luna's father has the Quibbler and he owes us more goodwill than he can repay. It goes in the Quibbler tomorrow. People who read it will share it. The magical population of Britain, Harry paused, they learned magic from your legacy. Every spell they know, every principle of magical law that structures their lives, the institution their children are governed by, all of it traces back to you. Let them hear from you directly. Merlin looked at him steadily. You're asking me to do something I've never done. In 1500 years. In 1500 years. He paused. I was not public, in the way you're describing. I built structures. I worked in councils and meetings and long negotiations. I was not, he stopped. There was something in his expression that Harry read as the particular difficulty of a private person being asked to be visible. Not vanity, almost the opposite of vanity. The discomfort of someone who has always worked through institutions and is being asked to step in front of them. The institutions aren't working, Harry said, gently. That's why we're here. A long beat. Give me a quill, Merlin said. He wrote for 2 hours. Harry and Hermione worked on the appointment challenge documentation and Ron made lunch and intermittently read out sections of the Prophet article in the tone of increasing disbelief, and Merlin sat at the drawing room desk and wrote with the focused stillness of someone for whom writing was not self-expression but precision work, the same quality of attention he brought to everything. When he finished he handed the pages to Harry without comment and Harry read them and then read them again. It was not what Harry had expected. He'd expected legal argument, historical account, institutional analysis, all the things Merlin had demonstrated he was extraordinary at. Instead what he read was quieter than that. It started with a single sentence, I helped build a world that I am told has been trying, in various ways and under various names, to unmake itself for the better part of 1,000 years, and I am here now because someone finally asked me to help stop it. It went on from there. Not with anger, though the anger was present underneath every sentence. With the particular tone of someone who had been watching from a very long way away for a very long time and had opinions about what they'd seen that were worth hearing. It named things. It drew lines. It was, Harry thought, the most honest piece of writing he'd encountered about magical Britain since Dumbledore's notes, and it had none of Dumbledore's tendency toward the gnomic. "This is extraordinary," Hermione said, reading over Harry's shoulder. "Can you get it to Luna's father today?" Harry asked. "Already sending the owl," Ron said, and he was, the letter already tied to the leg of a patient-looking tawny. The disagreement happened at 3 o'clock, and it came, as the sharpest disagreements often do, from a place where both sides were completely right. Harry had been looking at the Heritage Conservation Associates' office in Diagon Alley, specifically at the business registration documents, the client list Hermione had managed to obtain through a Freedom of Information request, and the connection between the firm's operations and the 17 businesses in Diagon Alley that were now offering ancestry consultation services. The picture it assembled was of an organized economic coercion network that was going to keep operating whether or not the Heritage Registration Act was annulled, because it had been built to function independently of the Act. "We need to shut it down," Harry said. "We need to shut it down legally," Hermione said. "Yes, that's what I said." "No, you said, shut it down." "I'm adding the word legally because I know what shut it down means when you say it in that tone of voice." Harry looked at her. "What tone of voice?" "The one that means you're about to do something that's definitely effective and possibly not the right approach." "Describe the wrong approach you think I'm contemplating." "Walking into that office and making it very clear in person that it needs to close," Hermione said. "Which, yes, it would work, they'd close tomorrow morning, but it sets a precedent that the way you solve problems is through direct personal intimidation using the most powerful object in the history of magic, and that precedent has consequences for everything we're trying to build." Harry opened his mouth. "She's right," Merlin said. Harry looked at him. Merlin was looking at Harry with an expression that was on Harry's side and disagreeing with him simultaneously, which was a specific quality he was developing that Harry was learning to respect and found occasionally frustrating. "You could walk in there and with the Elder Wand in your hand and your presence those people would close by sunset," Merlin continued. "I know this because I know what fear of power does to people. But Hermione is identifying a real problem. If the method is Harry Potter and the Elder Wand make problems go away through presence and implied force, then what you're building is not a free society. It's a better-intentioned version of what you're tearing down." "I wasn't going to threaten anyone," Harry said. "I know," Merlin said. "You weren't going to threaten them. You were going to stand there, visibly, with the Elder Wand, in a way that didn't technically constitute a threat but functioned as one." He paused. "The distinction matters enormously." Harry was quiet for a moment. The argument was correct and he knew the argument was correct and it still sat uncomfortably because the fastest solution to Heritage Conservation Associates was being ruled out on grounds that were principled and right and deeply, deeply irritating in their rightness. "Okay," he said. "Legally." "How?" "Business fraud," Hermione said, with the alacrity of someone who had been waiting to give this answer. "The services they're offering are presented as advisory, but the implicit coercion, demonstrate support for the framework or face license review, constitutes unlicensed enforcement activity. They're acting as if they have regulatory authority they don't have. We file with the Department of Magical Business Regulation, which is one of the 3 departments not controlled by the Preservation Council, and we attach the testimony from Madame Malkin and 6 other Diagon Alley businesses we documented during the diagnostic." "How long does that take?" "If I file today and flag it as urgent, 3 to 5 business days for initial review, potentially a week for a suspension order." "A week," Harry said. "A week," Hermione confirmed, with the expression of someone who knows that's not the answer the other person wants. Harry looked at the ceiling briefly. "File it." "Already started," Hermione said. "Obviously," Harry said. The thing Merlin had predicted happened at 4:30, and it didn't come at Harry. It came at Ron. A knock at the door of Grimmauld Place, which was unusual because almost no one knew the address, and Ron went to answer it because Harry was across the room and got there first, and came back 2 minutes later with the look of someone who is managing something carefully. "It's Draco Malfoy," Ron said. The room went quiet in a specific way. At the door, Harry said. Standing on the step. No one visible. He said. Ron paused, in the manner of someone conveying a message they find personally objectionable but are delivering accurately. He said he needs to talk to you. He said it's about his father. Harry looked at Merlin. Merlin's expression was careful and considering in a way that meant he was running analysis rather than reacting. Let him in, Harry said. Ron's expression conveyed his feelings about this with the eloquence of someone who had very few good memories involving Malfoys on his personal property, but he went and let Draco in, and Draco Malfoy came into the drawing room of Grimmauld Place and looked nothing like Harry had last seen him. He was 20 now, a year older than Harry, and the war had done different things to him than it had done to most people, not hardened him exactly, more like stripped things away until what was left was the actual architecture of who he was without the posturing. The arrogance was gone or at least not visible. What was there instead was a controlled tension that Harry recognized because he saw it in the mirror, the look of someone managing several things they were not going to explain. He looked at Merlin for 3 seconds longer than he looked at Harry, and then he looked at Harry. My father is going to burn Hogwarts, Draco said. The sentence arrived in the room and stayed there. Explain, Harry said. Draco sat down, which was unexpected, and it was the sitting down of someone who hadn't slept and needed to be off their feet. He's been running the public narrative campaign since the session. You know that. The prophet piece, that was him, yes. But the narrative campaign isn't the main operation. It was cover. He looked at his hands. He's been in contact with the Foundational Families Consortium since the night of the session. Not meeting them, activating them. They're not just a social organization, they never have been. There's a charter within the charter, a commitment that goes back to 1692 to defend foundational magical institutions against, he paused, what they call destabilization. And they've decided we're destabilizing, Harry said. They've decided you're destabilizing. My father has argued that what's happening is an attack on the foundational institutions of magical Britain, and that the response permitted under the inner charter is, Draco stopped, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite fear but was in the vicinity of both, is the removal of the destabilizing element by whatever means necessary. By whatever means necessary, Harry repeated. Hogwarts is, the founders built it as the institutional expression of British magical education. In the consortium's framework, it's one of the protected foundational institutions. If someone in the consortium argues that the current headmistress is complicit in destabilization, McGonagall, Harry said. She signed the authentication documents. If they argue she's complicit and the consortium activates its protective charter, they have the right, under their own legal interpretation, to remove the head of a foundational institution and replace them with someone who will. They can't do that, Hermione said sharply. The Hogwarts Board of Governors, my father controls 4 of the 12 board votes and he's had private conversations with 3 others in the last 24 hours, Draco said. He wasn't looking at any of them, which Harry read as the expression of someone reporting something they are ashamed of knowing. 7 of 12 is a majority. If the board votes to remove McGonagall on a motion that my father frames as restoring institutional integrity, and he has 7 votes, then there's a legal pathway to replacing her with a consortium-approved candidate. The room was very quiet. When? Harry said. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. Draco looked up. 8 o'clock. It was called this afternoon. Emergency session. Harry stood up. Why are you here? He asked. Not aggressively, genuinely. You could have said nothing. Why are you here, Draco? Draco looked at him with the particular expression of someone answering a question they've been asking themselves. Because I spent a year sitting in a house where Voldemort lived while my parents were too frightened to do anything, and I know what it looks like when a good institution is about to be handed to the worst possible people, and he paused, and something very human went across his face, I'm done sitting in the house. Harry looked at him for a moment. Then, where is your father right now? He went to the manor this afternoon. The consortium meeting is there, tonight. And the board members he's spoken to, he has their commitments. He believes he does. Draco's voice carried a thread of something. My father is very good at securing commitments. He's less good at predicting when people have reached their limit. Meaning some of the 7 might be persuadable, Hermione said. Meaning at least 2 of them are people who said yes to Lucius Malfoy when the pressure was on and will say something different if given a face-saving reason to. Draco looked at Hermione with the wariness of someone genuinely uncertain of their reception and trying to be accurate anyway. I don't know which 2. I know they exist. We need to be at that board meeting tomorrow, Harry said. You're not a board member, Hermione said. No. But McGonagall is the subject of the motion. Harry looked at her. She has the right to respond to any motion that concerns her conduct. And, he looked at Merlin, the Hogwarts Board of Governors operates under the Hogwarts founding charter. Merlin's expression shifted into the particular quality of attention that meant he'd just identified something. Which I also wrote, he said. Which you also wrote, Harry confirmed. A beat. Then Ron, who had been standing by the door watching Draco with the expression of someone maintaining professional courtesy over personal history, said, Are you staying, or, I should go back, Draco said. If I'm not at the manor tonight he'll notice and, he stopped. Go, Harry said. Don't do anything that puts you in danger. If the meeting changes, if he moves the board session earlier, send word immediately. Draco stood. He looked at Harry with an expression that had several things in it that neither of them had the time or the particular vocabulary for, and nodded once, and left. The room regrouped. We trust that? Ron asked, the moment the door closed. We trust that his information is accurate, Harry said. Whether we trust his motivations is a longer conversation for another time. What matters right now is the board meeting. 7 of 12, Hermione said, already in her folder. Board composition, she pulled a page, I've been tracking this since October, just in case. The 4 Malfoy-controlled votes are Yaxley, Broadacre, Fitch, and Selwyn. The 3 he's recently spoken to, if Draco's right about the timeline, are most likely Greengrass, Parkinson, and Avery. Which leaves Hooper, Davies, Longbottom Sr., Sprouts on the board. Ron said. Retired head of Hufflepuff, appointed 2 years ago, extremely solid, Hermione said. And the 12th is, she checked, Xenophilius Lovegood. Luna's dad, Harry and Ron said simultaneously. Yes. Hermione closed the folder. So we have Sprout, Hooper, Davies, Longbottom, and Lovegood as the 5 clear votes against any motion to remove McGonagall. We need 2 more from the 3 persuadables, Greengrass, Parkinson, Avery, to block the motion. And if we can't get them? Ron asked. Then we need to make the motion itself invalid, Harry said. He looked at Merlin. The Hogwarts founding charter, Merlin said. Section 4. A motion to remove the head of Hogwarts requires unanimous board consensus in cases where the motion is brought on grounds of professional conduct, not majority, unanimous. He paused. It's one of the provisions that was written in when the founders were concerned about factional board politics being used to remove heads for political reasons. Hermione stared at him. Unanimous. Unanimous, Merlin confirmed. So even one vote against the motion invalidates it, Hermione said. Even one vote against, Merlin said. The majority clause that Lucius Malfoy is working from applies only to administrative and curricular motions. Personnel removal is unanimous. It's been that way since 520 AD. Does he know that? Harry asked. I doubt it, Merlin said. It's an obscure provision. Very few board challenges to headmasters have ever gone to vote, the threat is usually sufficient. The full charter text has not been in general circulation since, he considered, approximately 1200 AD. He thinks he has a majority, Harry said. He doesn't know he needs unanimity. Correct. Harry felt the cold, precise satisfaction of a piece of geometry resolving. Then we don't need to flip two persuadables. We need to make sure that at least one person who agreed to vote with Lucius Malfoy understands what they actually agreed to and decides not to. And we need to be there when the motion is raised, Hermione said, to invoke the unanimity provision the moment it comes to vote. McGonagall, Harry said. She needs to know tonight. I'll go, Merlin said. Everyone looked at him. I am faster than an owl, he said, with a dry practicality that Harry appreciated, and significantly more persuasive in person. He looked at Harry. I can manage independent transit while you're carrying the wand. I don't need to remain at your side at all times. How far can you? Far enough to reach Hogwarts from here. He met Harry's eyes. Let me go. She should hear this from me, and there are things I should tell her that are not about the board meeting. Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket, held the wand between his palms for a moment in the way he'd learned was the proper release rather than just handing it over. It wasn't a transfer of mastery, just a radius extension, and Merlin nodded and was gone. The drawing room was quieter without him in a way Harry was starting to find noticeable. Not empty, just different. Right, Ron said. So what are we doing tonight? You're going to Bill's, Harry said. Check on your mum and Ginny. Make sure the wards are solid. I'm not hiding at Bill's while, I'm not asking you to hide, Harry said. I'm asking you to be where your family is, because that's where Umbridge or Malfoy or both will go when they realize they're losing. Your family is the most visible target they have for coming at me, and you being there makes everyone safer. Ron held his gaze. Harry held it back. This was the argument Ron had been waiting for Harry to make, the one that was actually true, and they both knew it. If anything happens, Ron said. First mirror call, Harry said. I swear. Ron left at 6. Hermione stayed, because Hermione would stay through a structural collapse if she had something productive to do in it, and they worked through the evening on the appointment challenge documentation and the board meeting preparation and a separate brief on the business fraud filing, and outside the windows of Grimmauld Place London did its enormous oblivious evening things. And in the ministry somewhere Umbridge was recalibrating after losing 4 more Wisengamot seats when the appointment challenge landed, and in Wiltshire Lucius Malfoy was hosting a consortium meeting in a house that had once hosted Voldemort and was now hosting the polished, expensive, socially acceptable version of the same principles. Harry sat at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock with tea he'd forgotten to drink while it was hot and the elder wand lying on the table in front of him, and he looked at it. It looked back at him. Still warm. Still that faint amber quality that only he could see. You knew, he said, to the empty kitchen. When you built it. You knew it was going to take a very long time. The warmth of the wand was, in the way things that aren't voices can still communicate, a kind of answer. Merlin came back at 10, moving through the house with the quiet purposefulness of someone who has had a significant conversation and is integrating what came of it. Harry was still at the kitchen table. Merlin sat across from him and for a moment they were just two people in a kitchen at night and it felt, not normal exactly, but real in a way that some of the bigger moments hadn't. How is she? Harry asked. Determined, Merlin said. And not surprised, which is its own kind of answer about what she's been navigating. He paused. She wanted me to tell you something. What? That she has been the headmistress of Hogwarts for 1 year, and she has spent most of that year watching the same process you've been watching, and she is, her exact word was relieved. That someone is finally doing something. He looked at Harry. She also said, and I'm going to render this as accurately as I can, that if you end up in front of the Hogwarts Board of Governors tomorrow morning and need someone to present the founding charter's unanimity provision, she will do it herself and enjoy it considerably. Harry smiled. It was a real one, the kind that arrived without being planned. She's remarkable, Merlin said, and meant it. Yeah, Harry said. She is. He wrapped his hands around his cold tea and looked at the wand on the table and thought about tomorrow, and the board meeting, and Lucius Malfoy discovering that he didn't have a majority because majorities weren't sufficient, and what would happen when that plan failed, and what would come after that, and somewhere in the middle of thinking about all of it he fell asleep in the kitchen chair and Merlin, demonstrating a consideration that Harry wouldn't find out about until the next morning. When Hermione told him, conjured a blanket from the airing cupboard and laid it over his shoulders without waking him up, and then sat at the table in the quiet house and waited for morning, as he had been waiting, in various ways, for a very long time. Chapter 5, A New Foundation. The Board of Governors meeting was held in a room at the Ministry that had been requisitioned at short notice, which told Harry something. Lucius Malfoy had not wanted it at Hogwarts, where the building itself might have opinions. Smart, Harry thought. Also insufficient. He arrived at 7:45 with Hermione and the Elder Wand and a copy of the Hogwarts founding charter that Merlin had dictated from memory the night before and Hermione had transcribed and authenticated with a cross-reference to the Bodleian Archive's original manuscript. The authentication had taken until 2 in the morning. Hermione had not complained once, which meant she'd found the process genuinely interesting, which was the most reliable indicator that they were working with something important. McGonagall was already there when they arrived, standing outside the meeting room door in full robes, straight-backed, expression composed in the particular way that meant she was prepared for a fight and would not be showing that preparation to anyone. She looked at Harry and Hermione, noted the document folder and the wand, and gave one precise nod. "He's inside," she said. "Arrived 20 minutes ago. 3 of his 4 committed votes are already seated. The Persuadables, Greengrass, Parkinson, and Avery, arrived in the last 10 minutes. I could not read their positions from the corridor." "You don't need to," Harry said. "The unanimity provision makes their positions irrelevant." McGonagall's eyes moved to the folder in Hermione's hands. "You're certain of the provision?" "Merlin wrote it," Hermione said. "Then I'm certain," McGonagall said, with the simplicity of someone who has updated their entire calculation. The meeting room was long and wood-paneled and had a central table with 12 chairs, 10 of which were already occupied when Harry and Hermione entered behind McGonagall. The remaining 2 were technically for board members who hadn't yet arrived, which meant Harry and Hermione had no seats, which was fine, because what they needed wasn't a seat. Lucius Malfoy sat at the far end of the table. He looked up when they entered and his expression did not change by any measurable amount, which was a kind of confirmation. A man who is surprised does not immediately master the surprise, but a man who anticipated your arrival but did not expect it quite this early does something different, and that something was what Harry saw in the quarter-second before the mask came fully down. He knew they were coming. He didn't know they were coming now. "Mr. Potter," Malfoy said. "Miss Granger. This is a closed board meeting. I'm afraid, the subject of this meeting is Professor McGonagall's conduct," Harry said, pulling out a chair along the wall, not at the table, just in the room, and sitting in it with the unhurried quality of someone who is not concerned about the seating arrangement. "She has the right of response. We're here as her representatives. The board charter does not provide for external representatives, Article 9 of the Hogwarts founding charter," Hermione said, setting the folder on her lap and opening it to the correct page with the ease of someone who has read it enough times to open to it without looking. "The subject of any motion brought before the board is entitled to representation by any party of their choosing, with no restriction on who that party may be." She looked at Malfoy with polite, absolute composure. Page 7, third paragraph. "I can read it to the room if you'd like." The room had the quality of something recalibrating. The 10 occupied faces ranged across a spectrum from Selwyn, who was watching Harry with the expression of someone who expects to be physically threatened and is building up to feeling insulted that he isn't, to Sprout, who was sitting with her hands folded and the expression of someone who has been waiting for backup and has just seen it arrive, to Avery, whose face was doing something Harry couldn't fully read but which involved several layers of private uncertainty. Malfoy looked at Hermione. Looked at the folder. Made the calculation with the speed of someone who has been making calculations in difficult rooms for decades. "We'll proceed," he said. The board chair, a witch named Hooper who had been elected to the position 18 months ago and who had the expression of someone who had not anticipated her tenure being quite this eventful, called the meeting to order with a formality that was clearly a comfort to her and began working through the agenda. There were 3 items before the McGonagall motion. Harry let them pass. Hermione took quiet notes. Merlin was present at Harry's shoulder, manifested at low opacity, watching Lucius Malfoy with the specific attention of someone identifying the precise shape of an opponent. "He's going to move the McGonagall item before the standard procedure would call for it," Merlin said, quietly enough that only Harry could hear. "Watch for him to invoke urgency." 3 minutes later, Lucius Malfoy requested that item 4, the personnel motion, be moved to immediate consideration on the grounds of institutional urgency. "Told you," Merlin said. Hooper looked around the table. No one objected, which was either compliance or passivity. Harry had been reading the room and suspected, for at least 4 of the faces, it was the latter. People who had committed a vote to Lucius Malfoy in a private conversation sometimes discovered, in the actual room, that they were considerably less committed than they'd believed themselves to be. "Item 4, Hooper said. "The motion, as filed, is a motion of no confidence in the current headmistress of Hogwarts School, Minerva McGonagall, on the grounds of," she read from the document in front of her, "conduct prejudicial to the foundational interests of the institution, specifically her authentication of documents used in a politically motivated constitutional challenge." McGonagall sat very still. "The motion has been brought by Mr. Lucius Malfoy," Hooper continued, "as a formal representative of the foundational families consortium, and has been seconded by," a slight pause, "3 board members." She looked up. "Professor McGonagall, you have the right of response." McGonagall stood. She looked down the table at Malfoy with an expression that Harry had seen her give to students over 40 years of teaching, the one that said she had assessed you completely and found you significantly less consequential than you believed yourself to be, and said, "I authenticated a document. The document was valid. The authentication was requested in my capacity as headmistress of an institution whose founding charter explicitly designates the headmistress as a valid witness for charter-based legal proceedings." She sat down. "That is all." Malfoy looked at her with the courtesy of someone who has no respect whatsoever for the person they're being courteous to. "The headmistress's role in this matter goes beyond authentication," he said to the room. "She provided the legal foundation for a challenge that was designed to destabilize. I want to speak to the motion procedure before we go further," Harry said. Hooper looked at him. "Mr. Potter, you're here in a representative capacity, yes?" Harry opened Hermione's folder to the page she'd marked. Article 14 of the Hogwarts Founding Charter. Personnel removal motions. "I'd like to read the relevant section." Malfoy's expression moved, not much, but enough. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know what. Harry read it. Clearly, at a pace that let every word land separately. The unanimity provision, exactly as Merlin had articulated it, exactly as Hermione had transcribed and authenticated it, a motion for the removal of the head of Hogwarts School, when brought on the grounds of professional conduct, shall require the unanimous assent of all seated board members in order to carry. A single dissenting vote shall be sufficient to defeat the motion. He set the document down. The room was quiet. "That's not," Selwyn began. "It's the founding charter," Hermione said pleasantly. "Would you like to see the Bodleian authentication?" "The current board charter is a derivative document," Harry said. "The Hogwarts founding charter takes precedence over all subsequent instruments. This is not a matter of interpretation. It's a matter of legal hierarchy." He looked at Malfoy. "You need 12 votes to carry this motion. Unanimous assent. You don't have 12 votes." The silence that followed was the kind that comes when a structure that seemed solid reveals that it was resting on something that wasn't there. Lucius Malfoy looked at Harry across the table with an expression that had finally dropped below the surface. Not anger, he was too controlled for anger. But something colder and more honest, the look of someone who has been outmaneuvered and knows it and is already measuring the distance to the next position. "I would like to put the motion to a vote," he said, quietly. "You're entitled to do that," Harry said. Hooper, who was reading the founding charter provision with the focused attention of someone who takes procedures very seriously and has just found one she wasn't aware of, looked up. "The representative is correct. The provision is clear. All in favor of the motion. 4 hands went up. Malfoy's own, Yaxley's, Broadacre's, Fitch's. Selwyn, Harry noted, did not raise his hand. Neither did Greengrass, Parkinson, or Avery, who had all, apparently, decided that the room felt different from what they'd been promised in private conversations. All opposed. 7 hands. Every other person at the table. The motion fails, Hooper said, with a precision that carried something underneath it that might have been satisfaction. By reason of failure to achieve unanimous assent as required under the founding charter provision. The motion is recorded as defeated. She looked at her papers. The board meeting is adjourned. People moved. Chairs scraped. The room began its particular post-decision shift where alliances were visibly reassessing themselves and nobody wanted to be seen talking to the wrong person. Lucius Malfoy stood. He straightened his robes. He picked up his cane. And then he looked at Harry with the particular quality of attention that Harry had come to understand was his version of being direct. "You are very determined," Malfoy said. His voice was exactly even. "I have found that very determined people tend to stay determined until they have something to lose." "I've had things to lose my entire life," Harry said. "It hasn't slowed me down yet." A pause. Something shifted in Malfoy's eyes, not concession, not exactly, but the recognition of a quality in someone else that you cannot dismiss. He held Harry's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he walked out. Harry watched him go. Merlin was fully manifested beside him and watched Malfoy's exit with the focused attention of someone tracking a variable. "Is he done?" Harry asked quietly. "He's done with this specific line of attack," Merlin said. "He's not done." "I know." McGonagall appeared at Harry's other side. She looked at the door Malfoy had just exited through and then at Harry, and her expression was the most unguarded he'd seen it outside of late-night crisis conditions. "Thank you," she said. "He wrote the provision," Harry said, gesturing at Merlin. 500 years before it was needed," McGonagall said, and she looked at Merlin with an expression that was as close to open admiration as she ever got. Remarkably prescient. "He'd seen it before," Merlin said. "Different names. The same move." McGonagall looked at both of them and said, with the precision of someone identifying the core of something, "What happens now?" "Now we finish it," Harry said. The appointment challenge hearing was at 9, which gave them 45 minutes, which was enough. Ogden convened it with the same careful thoroughness he'd brought to everything since the foundational challenge, and the appointment challenge was, if anything, more straightforward than the first one. The seat continuity regulations were unambiguous. The 7 notification failures were documented. Hermione had the original appointment records, the notification logs with the 7 gaps clearly marked, and an affidavit from each of the 7 seat holders who had never been informed of the reconfirmation requirement. The 7 appointments were declared invalid. The Ministerial Support Act that had been passed with those invalid seats was declared voidable. The oversight board that the act had created was declared constitutionally without foundation, pending a formal dissolution order. Umbridge, who had been sitting in the public gallery in the specific stillness of someone holding something in, stood up as Ogden began to read the final ruling. "This is not constitutional review," she said. Her voice had dropped the warmth. What was left underneath was something harder and older and, Harry thought, genuinely believed. "This is the dismantling of the institutional structure that has protected magical Britain for 500 years. This," she looked at Harry with an expression that was, beneath all its other qualities, sincere, "is the destruction of our heritage." "Our heritage," Harry said. He didn't raise his voice. "Tell me whose heritage you mean." She looked at him. "Tell me if Mary Catamole's heritage is included in the one you're protecting. Tell me if Hermione's is. Tell me if the Muggle-born children who've been watching their parents try to get ancestry documentation together for the last 6 months are part of the heritage worth preserving. The stability of magical society, the stability of some magical society," Harry said. At the expense of the rest of it. He met her eyes. That's not a heritage. That's a hierarchy. Umbridge looked at him and her face did something complicated, the expression of someone who has held a belief for so long that it has become indistinguishable from themselves, and who is, in this moment, having the first serious engagement with the possibility that the belief might not be true. It was not a comfortable thing to watch. It was not a comfortable thing to cause. But it was real, and Harry didn't look away from it. The ruling stands, Ogden said. And struck his gavel. The dissolution order for the Oversight Board went through by 11 o'clock that morning, drafted by Hermione and signed by Kingsley with a steadiness of hand that said everything about what it felt like to remove a cage you'd been in for 7 months. The reinstatement of Pembridge happened by noon. The suspension notices for Cross and the other 3 ministry employees were rescinded by 1 in the afternoon, with a formal record notation that the suspensions had been constitutionally invalid. Thickness resigned from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at 2, before he could be removed, which was a different kind of information about what he thought was coming. His resignation letter cited personal reasons, which was the oldest formulation in the book. The Heritage Conservation Associates office in Diagon Alley received its business regulation suspension notice at 2:30. Harry knew because Hermione sent him a mirror message that read, in full, "Done." Madame Malkin took the sign down herself. He read it standing in the corridor outside Kingsley's office and felt something he didn't immediately have words for, not triumph exactly, more like the particular relief of a pressure that has been constant for so long you stop noticing it until it lifts. Ron arrived at Grimmauld Place at 3 with Ginny and a bag of food from the Leaky Cauldron and the expression of someone who has been getting mirror updates all day and wants to be physically present for the rest of it. Ginny hugged Harry for a long time without saying anything, which was Ginny's version of communicating a great deal, and then pulled back and looked at him and said, "You look different." "Different how?" Harry asked. "Less like you're waiting for something terrible," she said. "More like you're just, here." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "I think that's right." They ate at the kitchen table, Harry, Ron, Ginny, Hermione when she arrived at 4 with 3 fresh notebooks and the look of someone who has been productive for 9 hours and is prepared to be productive for 9 more, and Merlin sat with them and did not eat but had the specific quality of presence that means someone is fully in a moment rather than merely observing it. Ron looked at him across the table at one point and said, "Is this strange for you? Sitting at a table?" Merlin considered this with the honesty he applied to everything. "The last table I sat at for a meal," he said, "the occasion ended rather badly." Ron looked at him. "How badly?" "There was a sword involved," Merlin said. "Several swords. And a significant amount of political betrayal." "Arthur?" Harry asked. "Among others." He looked at his hands. "I had been insufficiently attentive to the people who were closest to the problem while I was focused on the structural solutions." He looked up. "I have thought about that for 1500 years." The table was quiet for a moment with the particular weight of something that is both old tragedy and current lesson. "You were paying attention this time," Harry said. "I had better teachers," Merlin said, and looked at Harry with the expression that was warmth and directness and something underneath both of those things that Harry understood was the closest Merlin was going to come, in ordinary language, to what it had meant to spend 1500 years waiting and then find the right person waiting on the other end. The afternoon moved into early evening, and Harry had been expecting the quiet to hold until morning but the quiet didn't hold, because Umbridge's last move came at 6 o'clock and it came from a direction no one had fully anticipated. The mirror flashed. "Arthur Weasley." Harry answered it immediately. "There's something happening at the Department of Mysteries," Arthur said, without preamble. His voice had the specific quality that Harry associated with situations that had moved beyond the administrative and into something older and less structured. "An hour ago, 3 members of the Preservation Council, Yaxley, Selwyn, and a third I haven't identified, were seen entering through the Unspeakable's private access. They have not come out." Harry was on his feet before Arthur finished. "The Department of Mysteries," Hermione said, and her voice had changed in a way that said she was running through implications fast. "What's in there that the Preservation Council would want?" "The time room," Merlin said. Everyone looked at him. His expression had a quality Harry hadn't seen in it before, not fear, nothing so simple, but the look of someone who has identified a danger by recognizing its specific shape from a long way back. "There are records in the Department of Mysteries," Merlin said, "that have been there since long before the Ministry occupied that building. Records I placed there, or had placed there, in the years before my," he paused, "absence. The foundational magical compacts. The original charter documents, not copies. Things that, if destroyed or altered, would remove the primary source evidence for everything we've been doing," Hermione said. Her voice was very steady because she was very frightened. "Every constitutional challenge. Every founding charter provision. Without the originals, everything we've built in the last week becomes legally contestable," Harry said. He was already moving. "Harry," Merlin said, and there was something in his voice that stopped Harry in the doorway. Not caution, Merlin did not deal in the kind of caution that meant don't go. Something more specific. "The Department of Mysteries has its own protections. Ancient ones. They will not simply open for you." "I've been in there before," Harry said. "Not like this," Merlin said. "Not with what we're carrying." He looked at the wand in Harry's hand. "The wards in the deepest chambers of that building are mine. They respond to the wand. If we go in together, as one unit," he held Harry's gaze, "we can move through them. But I need you to trust the wand's direction completely. Don't override it. Don't cast independently if it's guiding you. Feel what it's doing and follow." "I know how to work with you," Harry said. "Yes," Merlin said. "You do." Ron grabbed his jacket. Hermione was already at the door. Harry looked at Ginny. "I'm coming," Ginny said, in a tone that was the end of the conversation. Harry didn't argue. The honest truth was that Ginny Weasley with a wand was an asset in any room, and arguing otherwise would be both wrong and disrespectful. "Then come." They went through the Floo, Ministry of Magic, main atrium, the fastest route, and the atrium was quiet at 6 in the evening, the day staff mostly gone, a few night shift workers passing through who looked at Harry's group with the alert recognition of people who have been watching the last week's events from the inside. Down through the lifts. The Department of Mysteries corridor had its familiar quality of wrongness, the feeling of spatial logic working differently down here, the way the floors and ceiling seemed to have opinions about direction that didn't match the conventional ones. Harry had been here at 15, terrified and too slow. He was here at 19, moving at a pace that the corridor itself seemed to register differently. The black door was open. Not just unlocked. Standing open, which it had never been in Harry's experience, which meant someone had used something significant to open it and hadn't bothered to close it behind them. Beyond it, the circular room, the identical black doors, the blue candles. "Straight ahead," Merlin said, in the internal way that was sharper and more directional than usual. "The doors are cycling. Don't touch the walls." Harry didn't touch the walls. He walked to the center of the circular room and felt the wand's warmth intensify in his hand, not guiding him left or right but down, a sensation like the magic in the wand was pointing through the floor, and he understood this to mean the room they needed was below the level they were on. "There's a lower level," Ron said. "There has always been a lower level," Merlin said. "The Ministry built over it. The lower level is older than the Ministry." The door that opened onto the stairs down was the one directly opposite where they'd entered, and it opened when Harry put his hand flat against it, not a spell, just contact between his palm and the wood, and the wand's warmth moved through him and through the door, and the door moved. The stairs went down a long way. The walls changed texture as they descended, from Ministry standard stone to something older, rougher, with the quality of a place that has been exactly what it is for a very long time without any attempt at presentation. They came out into a chamber that Harry didn't have adequate words for. It was circular, like the room above, but where the room above was the Ministry's version of dramatic, black doors, blue candles, theatrical, this was simply real. The walls were raw stone. The ceiling was high enough to lose in darkness. And in the center of the room, on a plinth that had clearly been there since long before any surrounding architecture, was a collection of documents in cases that glowed with a preservation enchantment so old it had a different color from modern ones, not the standard ministry blue but a deep amber, the same amber as the Elder Wand. 3 people were at the plinth. Yaxley, Selwyn, and a third figure Harry didn't recognize, large, hooded, standing slightly apart in a way that said they were the magical muscle rather than the intellectual driver of this operation. Yaxley had a tool Harry had seen once before in an Auror briefing, a magical dissolution instrument, designed for removing preservation enchantments. He was running it along the edge of the nearest case with the careful, methodical quality of someone who has been given a specific task and is executing it. "Stop," Harry said. They stopped, because the room changed when he spoke. Not because of the words, because of the quality of the magic in it, the Elder Wand responding to his intent in the way Merlin had described on the first night, not commanding but intending, and the intention was so clear and so complete that the ambient magic of the room aligned with it in a way that made standing against it feel, instinctively, unwise. Yaxley looked at Harry. His expression was the specific one of someone who has committed to a course of action and is trying to determine if the obstacle in front of him is actually insurmountable or just looks that way. "Step back from the cases," Harry said. "This doesn't concern you," Yaxley said, which was perhaps the least accurate sentence spoken in that room in 1500 years. "These documents concern me directly," Harry said. "They concern everyone who's been using them for the last week to hold your organization constitutionally accountable." He was walking toward them as he spoke, not fast, not slow. "Step back." The hooded figure moved. Harry didn't think about it. The wand came up and the magic that came out of it was nothing like standard defensive casting, it was structural, foundational, the same quality as what Merlin had demonstrated in the Wisengamot chamber, touching the room at the level of its original wards. The hooded figure hit the ward and stopped as completely as if they'd walked into a wall, which functionally they had. Selwyn cast something, Harry felt it rather than saw it, a cutting hex aimed at the plinth rather than at him, designed to damage the cases regardless of what else happened in the room. He redirected it without thinking, the wand moving in his hand with the fluid ease of something that had been building toward exactly this kind of use for a very long time, and the hex curved back and spent itself harmlessly against the far wall. Then Merlin came fully into the room. Not the partial manifestation Harry was used to, the low-opacity presence at his shoulder, the ambient warmth. This was complete, and it had a quality that filled the chamber in a way Harry had not experienced before. Merlin in full presence, in the room he had warded, standing over the documents he had placed here, looking at the people trying to destroy them, and he was 1500 years old in a way that was suddenly, unmistakably, utterly apparent. Yaxley's dissolution instrument dropped to the floor. It didn't fall, it was set down, carefully, by someone who has just assessed a situation and concluded that the thing they were holding should not be in their hands anymore. Selwyn took a step back. The hooded figure was already moving toward the exit. "Sit down," Harry said, and they sat, all three, on the stone floor of a room 1500 years old, because the alternative was something none of them wanted to test. Harry put the wand in his jacket. Looked at Merlin. Merlin was looking at the documents in their amber-glowing cases with the expression of someone seeing something they had not been certain still existed. "They're intact?" Harry asked. "Intact," Merlin said. His voice was quieter than usual. "All of them." The dissolution hadn't progressed far enough to breach the cases. He looked at Harry. "Another 5 minutes." 5 minutes, Harry repeated. "Yes." Merlin looked at Yaxley on the floor. They knew what they were doing. This was specific and targeted and informed by someone who understood what these documents are and why they matter. He paused. This was Umbridge's operation. Not Malfoy? Ron asked. Malfoy would not have sent 3 people with a dissolution tool, Merlin said. He'd have sent one person with a forgery, altered the documents rather than destroying them, and spent 3 months making the alteration undetectable. This, he looked at Yaxley and Selwyn on the floor, is the move of someone who is out of time and out of patience and willing to simply destroy rather than preserve the illusion. "Where is she?" Ginny asked. Harry looked at the mirror. He hadn't looked at it in 20 minutes. There were 4 messages from Arthur. He read the most recent one. Umbridge left the Ministry at 1745. Not by flu. Not by apparition from the registered points. Where she went is unknown. Kingsley has an arrest warrant ready. She's done too much tonight to walk away from procedurally, but we need to find her first. Harry looked around the chamber. Looked at the documents. Looked at Merlin. She can't reach these now, Harry said. The room knows. He looked at Merlin with a question. Merlin placed his hand flat against the plinth and the amber glow deepened and shifted, and Harry felt the warding in the room change, not radically, but fundamentally, in the way that a lock changes when the master key updates its configuration. The room now responded to Harry as clearly as it responded to Merlin, a co-authorization written into the wards themselves. Whatever Umbridge was planning, these documents were no longer accessible to it. She'll go to ground, Hermione said. Someone will be sheltering her. She has allies who owe her more than the Preservation Council can withstand losing right now. She was already thinking through it. We need to, the mirror flashed. Hermione's mirror this time, her own network, separate from Harry's. She answered it. It was Luna Lovegood, which was not who Harry expected, and her voice had the quality it always had of being simultaneously the most serene and most precisely informative voice in any situation. The Quibbler article went out an hour ago, Luna said. It's been reproduced 17 times already. I've been watching the owl patterns. It's quite beautiful really, like watching water move. Also, Dolores Umbridge is at Madame Putafoot's in Hogsmeade. She's been there since 5. Apparently she has tea there every week and no one thought to check routine locations. A pause. Daddy says hello. Hermione looked at Harry. Harry looked at Ron. Ron looked at Ginny. Madame Putafoot's, Ron said. Of all the, Ginny started. Get Kingsley to activate the warrant, Harry said to Hermione. Have him send Aurors to Hogsmeade now. Don't go through law enforcement, Robards directly, Hermione said, already on it. Robards had been reinstated to the head of law enforcement position 40 minutes after Thickness' resignation, and while Harry wouldn't call him an ally exactly, he was someone who took his professional obligations seriously and had had a difficult year under Thickness' thumb. They left the 3 of them on the floor of the chamber for Aurors to collect, which happened in under 20 minutes because Hermione had also messaged 2 Aurors she trusted personally who arrived looking extremely purposeful, and then Harry and his group went back up through the old stairs and into the Ministry proper and back out into the evening. Dolores Umbridge was arrested at Madame Putafoot's in Hogsmeade at 7:15. She was on her second cup of tea, according to the arresting Aurors report, and she did not resist. She sat with her hands folded and her pink cardigan and her expression of sustained outrage, and she was arrested on charges that Hermione had been quietly building for 3 weeks, charges that went considerably beyond tonight's operation and included the full record of everything the Preservation Council had done across the preceding 8 months, documented in a comprehensive, meticulous, legally unimpeachable way that only Hermione could have assembled them. When the Auror read the charges, Umbridge said, "This is politically motivated." The Auror said, "Madam, these are factual records." She said nothing after that. Harry found out about the arrest via mirror at 7:30, standing on the steps of the Ministry in the evening air, and he stood there for a moment with the message still glowing in his palm and Merlin beside him and the city moving all around them in its enormous ordinary way. "Is that it?" he said. "Not to anyone specifically." "For tonight," Merlin said. "For tonight," Harry agreed. The Quibbler article ran in full in every magical household in Britain by the following morning, and the effect of it was not what Harry would have predicted and was exactly what Merlin had said it would be. He'd said, "Put the author of the document in front of the people who've been living under the document and let them do their own accounting." What Harry had underestimated was how many people had been waiting for exactly that accounting, not the political class, not the Wisingamot, not the institution, the actual population of magical Britain, most of whom had been watching the last year with the uneasy awareness that something was wrong and the powerless feeling of not knowing how to say so. The letters that came to Grimmauld Place over the next 2 days, to Harry, to Hermione, some addressed simply to Merlin, care of Harry Potter, London, filled 2 boxes and spilled onto the kitchen floor, and Harry didn't have time to read most of them, but he read enough to understand what Merlin had understood from inside the wand across 15 centuries, that most people, given the opportunity to live in a world that was actually fair, wanted to. The machinery of injustice ran on the compliance of people who weren't consulted about their compliance and would have refused if asked. The compliance was ending. That was what the letters said, in 200 different ways, from 200 different people. The appointment challenge opened the Wisingamot hearing 3 days later, and the results moved fast, because facts do move fast when no one is in a position to bury them anymore. 7 invalid appointments reversed. 17 Wisingamot seats returned to their original holders or their designated successors. The Preservation Council's majority evaporated like morning frost. The Heritage Registration Act, already annulled under the foundational challenge, was formally removed from the legislative record. The Magical Heritage Registration Act was done. Hermione presented the new Magical Citizens Charter to the Wisingamot on the 7th day after the first session, which Harry felt was a timeline that had biblical resonance and which Hermione felt was simply the minimum time required to draft a document properly. The Charter established 5 things: equality of magical citizenship regardless of birth, independent oversight of the Wisingamot with direct public accountability, a free registry of all constitutional and founding documents accessible to any witch or wizard, an independent employment tribunal for magical workers with protections against exactly the kind of coercion Heritage Conservation Associates had been running, and a formal process for constitutional challenge that enshrined the Article 7 provisions permanently and explicitly. The vote was 39 to 8. 8 votes against. Harry had expected fewer, which was probably naive. There would always be 8 votes for the old structure, because the old structure had always been somebody's advantage. What mattered was the 39. Kingsley signed it. His hand was steady. His expression, when he looked up from the signature, was the expression of someone who has been trying to do something for a long time and has finally found the right tools. "This is a beginning," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This is a beginning. That's all we were claiming," Hermione said. "I know." He looked at Harry. "How are you?" It was a simple question and it caught Harry slightly off guard, which meant it reached somewhere real. He started, and stopped, and thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet. Ask me in a week." Kingsley smiled, and it was a real one. In a week, then. The last piece was something Harry had not planned and did not entirely understand until it was happening. He went back to the tomb on the 8th night. Not at midnight this time, early evening, the sky still pale gold in the west, the lake reflecting it. He walked out across the grass alone, because some things are properly solitary, and he stood in front of the white marble and took out the Elder Wand. Merlin was present beside him without needing to be called, which had been true for several days now. The distinction between active summoning and ambient presence had blurred over the week in a way that felt natural. "You know what I'm going to say," Harry said. "I think so," Merlin said. "It's not because we're done. We're not done. The Charter is the beginning, like Kingsley said, and there's years of work in it and," Harry stopped. "It's not because I want to be rid of you. That's not it at all." "I know," Merlin said. "It's because," Harry looked at the wand in his hand. "The wand answers to me because of what I needed it for and what I was willing to do with it. But I don't think I should carry the most powerful object in history indefinitely just because I can. I think," he paused, finding the right words. "I think the point of having it wasn't to keep it. It was to do something with it and then let it rest." "Yes," Merlin said quietly. "And the work that you needed to do, the reason you put yourself into it, is sufficiently advanced," Merlin said. Not complete. But, sufficiently advanced that someone who is not me can carry it forward. He looked at Harry. That someone being you. And your friends. And everyone who voted for the charter, Harry said. And Pembridge going back to his records. And Matilda Cross. And Madame Malkin taking down the sign. He looked at the tomb. It's a lot of people. That's what it always had to be, Merlin said. I learned that lesson the hard way. You can't build something like this on one person's power, however extraordinary that power is. It has to be everyone's. He paused. You knew that before you summoned me. I think I was starting to know it, Harry said. You helped me be sure. They stood in the evening quiet by the lake. The castle was lit up warm behind them. What will it be like? Harry asked. Going back. Not like sleeping, Merlin said. Not like before. The work is done, or enough of it. The intention that kept me present in the wand, the unfinished quality of it, he looked at his own hands with the expression of someone feeling something change. It's finished enough. I think it will be like, he paused, and something in his face was peaceful in a way Harry hadn't seen it, the particular piece of something that has been held in tension for a very long time finally permitted to release. I think it will be like coming home. Harry looked at him. 1,500 years of watching and waiting and the weight of an institution that had been built and corrupted and was now being rebuilt, and a man who had held all of that and was now being offered the thing he hadn't been certain he'd get, an ending. I'll finish it, Harry said. The work. I promise. I know you will, Merlin said, with a certainty so complete it wasn't reassurance, it was simply fact, delivered by someone who had watched Harry for 8 days and 1,500 years and had no doubt. Harry raised the wand. He said the release in Old Gaelic, the counterpart of the summoning, 3 words, quiet, the magic going down into the ground rather than out into the air. The release of an intention held for a millennium and a half, gently, deliberately, with all the care of someone who understands that the person they're releasing deserves to be released properly. The amber light in the wand did something it hadn't done before. It went very bright, not painfully, just completely, every bit of it at once, and then it went out. Not dark. Not cold. Just, still. Merlin was gone. Harry stood by the lake for a long time, holding the wand that was now just a wand, extraordinary, yes, the most powerful in existence, yes, but a tool rather than a presence, and the weight of the absence was real and quiet and not unhappy. More like the feeling at the end of a long conversation with someone who has told you everything they needed to tell you and you have told them everything you needed to tell them and then you've both gone home. He put it in his jacket. He would have to decide what to do with it properly, eventually. He had thoughts. Not tonight. He walked back toward the castle, and from inside it he could see warm light in the windows and one window in particular, the kitchen, probably, if the layout was the same as he remembered, lit up gold. He could hear something very faint across the grass. Voices. Ron's laugh, bright and sudden. Hermione saying something rapid and emphatic that made Ron laugh again. Harry stopped walking for a moment, just to hear it. 19 years old and the war was done and the ministry was not done but was becoming something different and the elder wand was quiet in his pocket and somewhere in the walls of Hogwarts the wards that Merlin had laid in 522 AD were running steadily, as they had always run, and across the lake the white tomb stood empty and peaceful. He thought about Fred. About Lupin. About Sirius and Cedric and Dobby and every name on the memorial wall in the entrance hall that he still couldn't read all the way through without stopping somewhere in the middle. He thought about them without flinching, which he couldn't always do, and he told them, not out loud, just the way you tell people things when there is no other way to tell them, that it wasn't over, but that today it was better, and that he was going to keep making it better, and that was the most honest thing he had. Then he kept walking. Inside, Ginny had saved him a seat. 2 weeks later, Harry stood in the great hall of Hogwarts for the first public reading of the new Magical Citizens Charter, which McGonagall had insisted on hosting at Hogwarts specifically because, as she said with the precision of someone making a deliberate point, this is where it begins. The hall was full, not just of current students, who sat at their house tables with the specific wide-eyed attention of people watching something they'll describe accurately for the rest of their lives, but of adults who had come from all across magical Britain, Fleur and Apparition and Broomstick and a few who had walked, because the news had moved through the community with the speed that only news people have been waiting for can move. Hermione read it. Harry had suggested Kingsley, and Kingsley had suggested Hermione, and Hermione had deflected twice before accepting that she was the right choice because she had written every word of it and cared about every word of it in the way that only the person who wrote it could. She stood at the lectern and she read, and her voice was completely steady, and the 5 principals went out into the hall and the hall was absolutely quiet. Harry sat in the front row between Ron and Ginny, and Ron had the look he got when he was proud of something but didn't know what to do with the pride, which meant his jaw was tight and his eyes were bright, and Ginny had her hand in Harry's and was listening with the focused, fierce attention she brought to important things. At the back of the hall, Harry could see faces he recognized and some he didn't. Arthur and Molly Weasley, Molly with the handkerchief she always had in situations that moved her. Kingsley standing near the door with the stillness he brought to moments of wait. McGonagall at the high table, hands folded, expression controlled over something that was clearly not controlled. Andromeda Tonks with Teddy on her knee, and Teddy's hair was currently indeterminate, cycling between colors in the way it did when he was too interested in something to settle. The reading finished. The hall was quiet for 3 seconds, and then Sprout started clapping from the high table, with the vigor of someone who has been waiting to do this, and the hall came up after her, not politely, not tentatively, but fully, the kind of applause that you hear in your chest. Harry didn't clap. He watched Hermione at the lectern, looking slightly overwhelmed by the response in the specific way she got when something worked that she'd put everything into, and he watched the hall, and he thought about 1500 years of an intention held in a piece of wood and what it had cost and what it had built and what came next, which was years of work and a great deal of argument and many more Wisengamot sessions and several things that hadn't gone wrong yet but would, and he thought about all of that without fear. Ron leaned over. "You all right?" "Yeah," Harry said. He was. "Good." Ron leaned back. "Because Hermione's already got a second charter drafted apparently." "Obviously. She showed me this morning. It's 40 pages. I'll read it tonight." "You're mad," Ron said, with the fondness of someone who has known a person their whole life and reached a settled peace with who that person is. "Probably," Harry said. He looked up at the enchanted ceiling. It showed a clear May evening, the first stars coming through. Somewhere in the walls of the castle the old wards ran warm and steady, and the work that had always needed doing was being done, and outside the windows magical Britain was not fixed and not finished but was, for the first time in a very long time, moving in the right direction. Harry Potter sat in the great hall he'd grown up in, at 19 years old, and let himself believe that.